Hey guys, this is Fiction Life. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video we will see second part, what if Amelia Bones discovered Harry Potter before Hogwarts. Here is short summary. When director Amelia Bones visits a quiet house in Surrey in July 1991, she discovers the truth about Harry Potter's life. What she finds changes everything, setting Harry on a completely different path long before Hogwarts ever begins. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. On Friday, the 29th of August, Harry and Susan were taken for a very special visit to the ministry building. They were taken direct to Aunt Emma's new minister's office and met two gentlemen, at least, they thought they were men, wearing deep blue robes with their hoods up. Both kids were under glamours at the time. From there, they were escorted down to level 9 of the underground ministry building, escorted by their aunt and the two folks they were now told were called Unspeakables, and taken through to a room that had a big circular-style arch with a tattered black wispy curtain hanging in front of it. As they were escorted into the room, both Unspeakables dropped their hoods and both pre-teens could see that the one who seemed to be in charge had salt-and-pepper-colored short hair and sported a black trimmed beard, while the other was a young woman who behaved far older than she appeared. Also in the room was a small pedestal table with a glowing white glass ball sitting upon a little wooden stand in the middle of it. Next to it were two small toy rubber SS. Though neither child asked why they were there, the Unspeakable in charge, he said his name was Croaker, handed each of the kids one of the toy SS. Then explained what he wanted them to do. "You just want us to throw these through that stone circle thing?" asked Harry, as if the man was being weird. "That's it, exactly, Mr. Potter," replied Croaker with a slight grin. "Miss Bones first, please." After a glance between the two kids, who both thought the adults were being weird, Susan lobbed hers through with a simple underhand toss. It disappeared through it. Then Croaker said, "And now you, Mr. Potter." Harry gave a huff of amusement which communicated, "I'm just amusing the adults," before he matched the same underhanded toss, his toy passing almost directly through the exact center. As soon as he did, both Unspeakables turned to look at the white glowing ball. It quickly dulled to a light gray and no longer glowed. The woman then walked to stand near the arch and cast a few charms, before she stepped back and firmly said, "No leakage." The experiment was successful. "Right," said Croaker, turning a grin to the two kids. "That's that done then." As they were then being led out, Susan asked, "Why did you want us to do that?" "It was an unspeakable experiment," replied Croaker. "We just needed two innocents to do it for us, and your aunt was kind enough to volunteer you two while you were here and visiting her in her new role as minister." "Weird," declared Susan. As Croaker chuckled, he said, "A lot of what we do is considered weird by some folks. It's still important, though." Harry was just happy Susan thought the same as him about it. Neither noticed that Bones, who had quietly accompanied them, had an expression of profound relief on her face. She was having trouble masking, occlumency or not. By the time the 1st of September finally rolled around, a Sunday, Harry was happy, relaxed, healthy, mentally very much on the road to recovery from his treatment at the hands of the Dursleys, beginning to be well versed in the etiquette of Wizarding Britain to the point he was confident in his rightful place and felt ready for Hogwarts. During his time at Bones Manor, Aunt Amelia had also led him through the financial situation of the Potter estate, that all the missing funds were recovered or in the process of being recovered by the goblins, together with the missing artifacts. "They've already recovered most of them, right?" he asked. "They have," she nodded. "Actually, I need to go and see Grimjaw to see how that's coming along." Once that part was out of the way, Bones then laid a box on the table between them and said, "And here is the heirs, rings of two of the houses for which you're the heir apparent, just not Slytherin and Gryffindor. For those, I'm getting rings made, but it takes time. Besides, I don't think you should wear them just yet, anyway." "Why not?" he asked. "Because it would cause problems for you and the staff at Hogwarts," she replied. "Besides being recognized as a first-year student, you would also be recognized as the rightful owner of Hogwarts. That would create a bit of a difficult situation for the staff and for you." "Oh," he said, getting it. "Because they won't know whether to treat me as a student or as their boss, right?" She smiled and replied, "Precisely. However, On top of that, whenever one of the students has a problem with one of the staff, they'll try to come to you to get you to overrule the staff. Which puts you in a difficult situation. Yeah, I can see that, he quickly said. You're right. It would be best if others don't know I own the school. Susan and young Hannah do, so you can quietly discuss it with them away from those trying to listen in, she suggested. Otherwise, please keep silent about it. I will, he firmly nodded. Good, thank you, she said. Then, indicating the box between them, she said, open it up. Once he'd opened it, he saw 3 rings within. They looked to him like signet rings. Pick up the one with the red shield and the griffin on it first, she said. And slip it onto the ring finger of your right hand. That's the heir's ring for Potter. Once he did that, felt it warm a little and shrink to fit, she said, now the black one with the flying horse creature on it. That's the heir's ring for Peverell. Once he picked it up he asked, which finger? Same finger, she replied. Just press it firmly against your Potter's heir's ring and the two will blend together. Harry did just that and felt them blend into one. And now for the signet ring identifying you as a recognized son of the House of Black. It had a raven on it. Harry picked up the much more slender ring, slipped it on the right finger and pushed it against the blended Potter and Peverell rings. As he'd already expected, it too blended with the other two. The ring was now a vertically halved shield in red on one side and black on the other. The red side bore a gold griffin while the black side bore a small winged horse Harry thought was a Pegasus but was quickly told was actually a Thestral. Below both and in the middle was the shadow outline of a raven. The Thestral is the totem animal of the Peverells, the griffin is the totem animal of the Potters, yet another reason why everyone thinks the Potters are closely tied to the Gryffindors, and the raven is the totem animal of the Blacks, she explained. It kinda looks pretty, he said, admiring it in the light. She smiled back and said, now that you wear those rings, don't ever take them off, Harry. I know, he said, I saw that Susan wears one and Mrs. Abbott told me what they mean. For me and Susan it means no one can insult us or treat us unfairly in any way. That's right, she smiled. And, if someone ever does treat you poorly, just hold up your hand while making sure you're showing them that ring. If they don't back off then, let me know immediately. Yes, Aunt Amy, he firmly replied. That earned him another smile. On the day of the first, the Bones household was up early for an early arrival at the Hogwarts Express platform, platform 9 3/4, at King's Cross Station in London. Aunt Ami's plan was for both children to be early arrivals and, therefore, reduce the amount of gawkers who would then stare at Harry. After breakfast and a last-minute check to ensure they had everything they needed, Bones took them via flow to her new office in the minister's office space. There, they picked up 2 Aurors who would be providing the minister her guards, and, subsequently, Harry. They also waited until a recently released from hospital Sirius Black also arrived before the adults all glamored themselves. From that moment on and until the sorting, Harry would be answering to his true name, Henry. It would save possible problems on both the platform and the train. Then they flowed directly to the platform. They arrived at barely past 10:15 a.m., which meant they had nearly 3/4 of an hour to wait until the train left the platform. Find a compartment and secure it for ourselves, asked Susan. Harry grinned back and nodded, but let Susan choose the compartment for them. To him, it didn't matter other than Hannah and Neville would be able to find them. Don't worry about that, she declared. I've got that covered. They chose a compartment in the third carriage and, with the help of the 2 Aurors who accompanied them on board, had their trunks stashed in the overheads. They'd not need them again until they arrived in the castle, as both also carried a small wizard-spaced backpack each that contained a couple of books and some healthy snacks Binti insisted they take with them. As they did not need to enter a Muggle area on their way to the platform they were already wearing their Hogwarts unaligned house uniforms. Before they left the compartment, Susan stuck a small 3-inch square piece of parchment to the window that had a picture of a blue flipper-footed dragon on it, covering almost the entirety of it. But she stuck it to the glass with the picture facing out. The sea dragon was the totem of House Bones. Surprised, Harry immediately figured out why and said, "That's very clever. Do Hannah and Neville know you were going to do that?" Wearing a pleased grin, she replied, "Uh-huh. Hannah's mum suggested it months ago. Auntie Pauline and her friends used to do it when they were students at Hogwarts. When they disembarked again, Aunt Amy shook her head in wry amusement before casting mild notice-me-nots over the pair of them. That way, she explained. You will be seen. However, you will not be properly recognized. Clever, muttered Sirius. What about Neville and Hannah? Asked Harry. Introduce yourself to them and they'll immediately see through it, she replied. The notice-me-not only works on those who are generally looking for either of you. Once you introduce yourself to someone, they'll be able to see through it. What about for the sorting? Harry immediately asked. When you respond to your name by walking forward to be sorted, you'll have effectively introduced yourselves, she replied. In good reasoning skills thinking to ask that, Henry. As the station started to fill up, Bones and Sirius shooed both children back onto the train. Don't worry, she assured them. Sirius and I will keep an eye out for the Abbotts and Longbottoms. The Abbotts arrived about 25 minutes before departure, just as Harry and Susan were reboarding, but the two Orrs told them to get on and they'd send young Hannah their way. The Longbottom parents were only a couple of days out of St. Mungo's themselves. They refused to remain any longer as they wanted to spend the last couple of days of August with their son before then escorting him to the platform to see him off for his first day at Hogwarts. However, because they were still quite unwell, Augusta put her foot down about how long they'd be allowed there. So they arrived about 15 minutes before departure. As soon as they did and met up with Bones, Sirius and the Abbotts Sirius conjured up 2 high chairs for them, a cross between a chair-backed bar stool and armchairs. Then levitated both into them. When Frank frowned at him, about to say something, Sirius got in first. You don't scare me, Longbottom, so don't even try. Your mother, however. Augusta gave a huff of false annoyance over humor and firmly stated, afraid of me, Black. So you should be. And both Lord and Lady Longbottom were firmly ordered to remain on the high chairs by Augusta. Do it or I'll activate your emergency portkeys, she firmly threatened. While Alice was more than willing to go along with it all, Frank mumbled, uppity woman. I should just disown you. See that I don't. Augusta chose to ignore it. Apparently it was a threat he'd been threatening her with about 3 or 4 times a day for the past 3+ weeks. Now it was just, water off a duck's back, to her. The same 2 Orrs who carried in Harry's and Susan's trunks and stowed them, also brought in Neville's and Hannah's and did the same. So, with the 4 children now, safely, in a compartment, they were able to catch up with what they'd been up to for the past few days. Neville was now also growing his hair longer and already had enough for his own gray silk ribbon to tie his hair back. As soon as the girls saw it they retied it for him in a much neater style. After explaining about their trip down to the Department of Mysteries, Neville asked, they wanted you each to throw a toy rubber S through a big arch thingy. Yep, said Harry. We were told it was an unspeakable experiment they needed our help with. Weird, said Hannah. That's what we thought, agreed Susan. One of things they discussed, of course, was yet again the houses and where they'd be sorted. They'd finally managed to convince Neville to get himself sorted into Hufflepuff with the rest of them. However, he didn't take much convincing. I've spent most of my life with my gran telling me I was expected to go into Gryffindor, he explained. When my mum heard of that she gave gran what for and said to me, you should go into the house that would serve you best, Neville dear. Let the sorting hat pick the best for you. I'm thinking Hufflepuff would be best for me, after all. The other 3 grinned back and they admitted, as too. He breathed a sigh of relief and said, Hufflepuff forever. Hufflepuff forever. They firmly agreed. Once the train left the platform, it was almost 15 minutes before a red-headed kid yanked the door open and stuck his head in looking around. Less than 3 seconds later he pulled his head back out and walked off, not even shutting the door as he did. Who on earth was that? Asked a thoroughly confused Harry. That was Ron Weasley, scowled Susan. His dad works for, worked for Auntie in the DMLE. He's really not a nice boy. Lacks manners, too, said Neville. He didn't even bother to knock, or anything. Or close the door, added Harry, standing up, walking over and closing and latching it himself. The rest of the journey had those walking past and peering within the windows before moving on. Either they were looking for friends or looking to see who else was on the train. No one else opened the door, let alone without knocking. When the cart lady came around with her little trolley cart and opened the door to ask if they wanted something off the cart, Harry was quick to get a small collection of almost everything on it. Don't let Aunt Amy know you bought all that, smirked Susan. I've not had much of a chance to try wizarding sweets before, Suze, he reasonably argued, don't you think now is as good a time as any to try them? That had the 3 other pre-teens all snicker or giggle. And the 4 of them worked their way through the small pile Harry had bought. The other 3 were also explaining what they were all like before Harry tried them, so he wouldn't be surprised by them. Another conversation between the 4 dealt with pets. Susan was happily sharing with Neville. Hannah and Harry already knew information all about her new snowy owl, Hedwig. And Neville was happily sharing similar information about his own new horned owl, Krigair. Uncle Algy presented me with a toad and told me it would be my pet to take to Hogwarts with me. I named it Trevor, he explained. But, Dad called Uncle Algy an idiot and presented me with Krigair, which is Swedish, apparently, for warrior, and firmly said a post owl made a lot more sense than a bleep toad. Bleep? Asked Susan. Neville blushed, looked down and said, he said a swear word there. I just replaced it with bleep. Harry snickered. Trevor's now in one of our home's greenhouses helping keep it clear of plant-eating insects, especially beetles. He loves beetles. Susan didn't choose her pet, either, said Harry. Hedwig chose her. Then Susan launched into a faithful retelling of what happened the moment she walked into Elop's in Diagon Alley. She just flew down, landed on your shoulder and refused to leave. Asked Neville. Pretty much, said Harry. Did you send her direct to Hogwarts like I did with Krigair? He asked. Yes, replied Susan. And what about you? Asked Hannah, looking to Harry. Fox has still decided you're his pet. He chuckled and said, apparently. I think he's adopted me. Think he'll be at the castle, waiting for you? Asked Neville. Harry shrugged and replied, I don't know, but I hope so. You've become attached to him too, smiled Hannah. Yeah, he sighed. I thought he would have left after he realized I was going to get better, or then got better. But, he hasn't yet. After their arrival at Hogsmeade and their trip across the lake in the little boats, a place where the Weasley boy was again searching for someone, they arrived at the doors of the castle. The whole way from the platform to the doors they were escorted by a really big bloke who Susan told Harry was named Rubeus Hagrid. But, he prefers to be called just Hagrid, she offered. Nice to know, said Harry, a little distracted like all the rest of the first years and practically gawking about. Once they were shown into the castle by a little man who stood, for some of them, even shorter than them, they were taken across the main entranceway and shown into an antechamber. The little man, who introduced himself as Professor Flitwick, deputy headmaster and head of house for Ravenclaw, gave them a little introduction and explanation of what was about to happen before he apologized and said he had to leave for a few minutes to check to see if the rest of the school was ready to receive them. As soon as he was out the door, the Weasley boy began to walk through the students calling, Harry. Hey, Harry, where are you? Even before he reached Harry he was intercepted by a skinny boy with slicked back hair who sneered at him and condescendingly asked, trying to make friends with Potter, Weasley. It would be, after all, the only thing you'd have to separate you from the riff-raff. Piss off, Malfoy, Weasley snapped back. That Harry's my best mate has nothing to do with you. On hearing that, Susan, Hannah and Neville all looked to Harry in surprise. Harry just looked back at them in confusion and whispered, I had no idea who he was until Susan told me his name. I've never met him before. Malfoy sneered, as if Harry Potter would ever be friends with someone like you. Why you, snarled Weasley, starting to draw his wand out of his pocket. That was as far as they got before Flitwick returned, saw what was going on and snapped, enough. When both boys looked back at him, he said, as soon as I learn which houses you two will be sorted into, you'll both be docked 5 points for making a scene. He gave that a moment to sink in before he then said, congratulations, the pair of you. That would have to be about the fastest a student has ever lost points on first arriving at the castle. It's not something you should be proud of, either. When my heir, Malfoy haughtily began before Flitwick snapped a flat, I dare you, expression back at him. It shut the boy right up. If you're done, said Flitwick, form 2 columns and follow me. I'll be taking you through to the Great Hall and the sorting. As Flitwick began to lead the 2 columns out, a nearby tall dark-skinned boy looked to Malfoy and asked, were you about to say, when my father hears about this, and add some inane threat to that, Malfoy? Malfoy just glared back and the boy added, "You do remember he's dead, don't you?" Malfoy snapped back, "Shut your mouth, Zabini. The Malfoy name still holds weight in political circles." Zabini just snorted and said, "Forget that Bones managed to get Fudge and Umbridge kicked out and then replaced him too, did you, Malfoy?" Malfoy just fumed back. Harry, Susan, Neville and Hannah watched it all while casting amused glances at each other. They were bringing up the rear. Even the Weasley boy had apparently given up, for the time being, trying to find Harry and convince one and all he and Harry were best mates. As expected, Hannah was first up for sorting. Professor Flitwick was standing on a small set of steps and was handling both the sorting hat and calling the names off a scroll of parchment. The hat sat on her head for only a moment before it quietly uttered, "By the four founders." Then immediately sorted her into her house by calling out, "Hufflepuff." As she hopped off the stool to the approbation of the students of Hufflepuff, she cast a look of surprise to her three friends and mouthed, "Sorry." None of the other three could figure out why she was apologizing for being sorted into the house the four wanted, anyway. Susan was next and the hat had barely reached her head before it called, "Hufflepuff." Boot went into Ravenclaw, as did Brocklehurst. Brown went into Gryffindor. Bulstrode into Slytherin. And the sorting continued alphabetically down through the list until they reached some girl named Granger. For some students there were clearly some surprises. The Granger girl sat on the chair, clearly trying to convince the hat of something before she developed quite the shocked expression. "He what?" she gasped. Then the hat called, "Ravenclaw." She quietly left the stool and made her way to the Ravenclaw table in dazed shock. Once Neville sat, again, the hat hadn't really been on his head for more than a moment before it called, "Hufflepuff." Neville cast a bemused eye on Harry and tossed him a thumbs-up gesture with a knowing smirk as he walked to the Hufflepuff table. Malfoy was up next and the hat didn't even reach sitting on his head before it called, "Slytherin." Another quarter way through the list of students and Harry was called. However, he was called as Potter, Harry. Calmly and with his head held high, but not too high to be thought haughty, he walked forward and stopped before stepping up onto the low dais on which sat Flitwick's steps and the stool the students sat upon to be sorted. Looking to the professor he quietly said, "Actually, Professor, while I answer to the name, Harry, as you were close to my parents in the time leading up to their deaths, you should know that my actual name is Henry. I was named after my great-grandfather. His name was Henry, but called Harry by his close friends. For official announcements in future, such as my being called up for my sorting, please address me as Henry Potter." The professor gaped in shock for a moment before he slightly blushed. "My apologies, Mr. Potter. Your name incorrectly sits upon my scroll as Harry Potter. I do, indeed, know your true name to be Henry. I shall correct the records at my first available opportunity. Potter, Henry." Harry replied, "Thank you, Professor, for your understanding and forbearance." Then stepped up onto the dais before the stool, smoothly pivoted on the toes of his right foot and sat. The hat was placed on his head a bare moment later. "Well, boss, isn't this a turn up for the grimoires?" said the hat in his mind. "Boss?" asked Harry. "Well, I thought it was a bit more polite than owner," replied the hat. "So, you know," Harry mentally smirked. "Didn't come as that much of a shock, really," replied the hat. "I knew your father was an heir, and his father before him, and so on. Just as I knew young Tom Riddle was the heir of Slytherin. I didn't tell him, though, Riddle, that is. That boy's mind was already a cesspit, evil little sprog. He'd have immediately abused the authority, if he knew. It didn't stop him from finding out, though," thought Harry. "No," the hat mentally sighed. "But, that had nothing to do with me. I wasn't blaming you," Harry was quick to assure. "I'm aware," replied the hat. "The shock was discovering from the mind of little Miss Abbott that you're now also the rightful heir of Slytherin. I don't think anyone saw that coming." Harry asked, "Did you also find out from her that Amelia Bones is bringing the 4 portraits of the 4 founders to the school tomorrow?" "Normally I'd never tell anyone what I saw in the mind of another," replied the hat. "However, I can see that you both knew and that you both knew the other knew, so, yes. I can also see that you have decided not to let others, but a very select few, know you're the rightful owner of the school. On your behalf I shall inform the castle's ghosts, portraits and house elves of that determination lest they unknowingly give away the secret." Harry mentally winced and sheepishly thought, "Oops. We didn't think of that. Again, I'm aware, replied the hat. It shall be my honor to inform them. Now, let's get you sorted before people start wondering too much about what is going on. Before I do, though, I ask you keep me informed of just when you intend to announce your ownership. I think the denizens should be informed first, yes. Fair enough, he firmly thought. Well, then, Hufflepuff. As the hat was plucked off Harry's head, he started walking to the Hufflepuff table in almost complete silence. It would have probably lasted longer if Susan, Hannah and Neville hadn't immediately started applauding. Their clapping triggered the rest. However, there was also a lot of shocked whispering going on between friends across all 4 tables. Harry didn't notice, as he had his back to that table, but the same thing was going on up on the head table. As he sat next to Neville and opposite Susan and Hannah, his 3 friends leaned in and Susan, first to speak, said, "You and the hat spoke to one another a fair bit. Have to spend a lot of time convincing it." "No," he replied. "It knows who I really am and wanted to let me know it will communicate with the ghosts, portraits and house elves not to let out the secret. It was going to sort me into Hufflepuff right off the bat, but wanted to chat for a minute first. I've more to tell you about that, but it's going to have to wait until we can all get together somewhere private." All 3 nodded back and sat back. As the sorting neared its end, Weasley was sorted into Gryffindor and Zabini went into Slytherin. As Zabini headed for the Slytherin table, Professor Flitwick vanished the steps he'd used, tucked the scroll under his arm, picked up the stool and hat and walked them off to the side of the room near the head table. Then Headmistress McGonagall stood to make a few announcements. She first announced she'd been appointed the new headmistress following the death of Albus Dumbledore and that Professor Flitwick had been appointed deputy headmaster. Next, she introduced the apparently new professors for History of Magic, Dada, Potions and Transfigurations. Then she announced a change in school policy, which would now see those who commit crimes being detained, the Aurors contacted and the student handed over to them. That caused quite a bit of shocked whispering among students, especially in Slytherin. A glare about the room from her had them all shut up again. Furthermore, she firmly stated, if the crime is proven, that student could at the very least be suspended from the school. For severe enough crimes, expulsion awaits you. I am not Albus Dumbledore and I will not turn a blind eye to crimes. Unlike our previous late and now unlamented headmaster, I do not see the commission of crimes as schoolchildren hijinks and just acting out. This will be the only warning you'll receive for the school year on this matter. As an example, simple common assault, even if through the act of a prank, is a crime. If a prank harms another, even if only for a few moments, you'll be leaving in the company of Aurors. A pair of third-year red-haired twins in Gryffindor glanced at one another before they sighed and disappointingly looked down at their currently empty plates. Next, at the completion of classes tomorrow, all students and staff are required to immediately return to here, the Great Hall. Please, do not even head for your common rooms first. I have been informed some very important and historic presentations will be made to the school by representatives from the ministry. I have been assured that those who miss it will be dirty at themselves for being so foolish. That is all the announcements I have for you at this time. Let the welcoming feast begin. Suddenly, all the tables were loaded down with food. Harry thought that, if the tables hadn't been built so sturdy, they'd have collapsed under the sheer weight. After Harry ate his fill, it wasn't long before the tables were cleared. McGonagall stood once more and said, "Prefects, please escort our new first years to your common rooms and give whatever announcements each house gives their new students at that time. However, tomorrow is a school day and I expect everyone within their beds within 30 to 45 minutes. Off you go." Before the Hufflepuff first years could even stand, they were quickly joined by 2 of the Hufflepuff senior years. The which of the 2 said, "Hi, folks. I'm Jemima and this is Robert," indicating the male with her. "We're the 2 fifth-year prefects for Hufflepuff. Please follow Robert and he will lead you to the Hufflepuff common room and dormitories. I'll be bringing up the rear to make sure we don't lose anyone." Harry was glad she'd barely tried to sneak a glance at his forehead when she first laid eyes on him. That was one thing that really annoyed him, as if he was his scar rather than the scar, now gone, was just a mark made upon him by a dark wizard. Robert led them back out into the entrance hall and down a flight of stairs before heading off to the right. They followed for about 100 yards before they came across what appeared to be a stack of barrels lying on their sides and embedded into the wall. Harry, Susan and Hannah already knew this was the entrance to the Hufflepuff rooms as the portrait of Helga Hufflepuff had described it to them. They also knew Harry, as the owner of the school, didn't need to use the password to get in, so he deliberately hung back so as not to unintentionally trigger the release. Robert then used his wand to tap an odd rhythm on the middle barrel. A moment later, the lid swung open on hidden hinges and he indicated everyone within. They walked down a short and slight ramp before entering a large rectangular room. As they all gathered within in a sort of clumped group, both prefects walked around them. Robert, gesturing with his offhand, said, "Spread out a little so you can all clearly see us." As their group opened up he was counting. 10 of you. 5 boys and 5 girls. That means we have exactly 1/4 of this year's intake of 40 students. That's a little low on usual years, but understandable. Jemima smiled at him for a moment before she turned back to the first years. "Welcome to Hufflepuff," she said. "Contrary to what the other houses might imply to you, or simply tell you outright to your faces, you should feel honored to make it into Hufflepuff. Hufflepuffs are those the Hat deem to operate better as a student among those who favor hard work and loyalty. Some will tell you that Hufflepuff is the house of the Duffers. However, I'm pleased to tell you that our current Minister of Magic was a Hufflepuff, so, 2 or 3 of the 8 directors of departments within the ministry. The lead singer of the Weird Sisters was also a Hufflepuff. Celestina Warbeck was one too. And so was the current editor-in-chief of Witch Weekly. Hufflepuffs are constantly rising to the tops of their chosen professions because they believe hard work is what is needed to get them there. That they got there and continue to get there is proof of that." Robert then took over and started indicating about the room. Unlike in somewhere like Slytherin, there is no hierarchy in the house other than prefect status. Everyone else is treated equally. Therefore, it's first come first served for where you choose to sit, what table you choose to do your assignments upon, that sort of thing. If the spot is currently vacant, you're allowed to sit there. Next, yes, the castle has house elves that keep it clean and tidy. However, that does not excuse you leaving your personal things lying around. In shared spaces, such as this common room and your shared dorms, always remember that others live here too. For example, no one wants to have to move your dirty socks out of the way so they can sit down on a chair. With a wry smirk he said, "Actually, I'm pretty sure that if anyone actually did that they'd have to later go and fish them out of the garbage." That had a couple of the first years titter, giggle or chuckle in amusement. Indicating the 2 sets of stairs, Jemima said, "For dorms, boys are down the stairs on the right and girls are up the stairs on the left. Boys, do not try to get up the stairs to the girls' side. The stairs will turn into a slippery slide, dropping you back out again. An alarm will sound and our head of house, Professor Pomona Sprout, will come running. Professor Sprout is generally a very placid lady, until a boy tries to get up those stairs. Then, boys, it would to be you." And smiled. "You need to be early in the Great Hall for breakfast as you need to have eaten before the class timetables are handed out. About that time, owl mail is also delivered," said Robert. "Oh, yes, owl mail is only delivered once per day and it is always as breakfast concludes. If you are not down in time and you are expecting a parcel or package, you'll have to wait until the next day to receive it. Don't worry too much about it for the first couple of weeks," said Jemima. "A senior will always come into your dorms and wake you to make sure you're up in time." Robert, they later found out his name was Robert Hawking, turned to Jemima Marchbanks and asked, "Is that it? We've covered all the important parts. Other than showing them to their dorms." "Yes," she replied. Turning back to the first years she said, "Ladies, if you would follow me, please. And, gentlemen," said Hawking, smoothly adding on, "if you would follow me." Harry discovered that the common room was only a very small percentage of the whole Hufflepuff Badger's seat. Down the boys' stairs they discovered a long hallway with many doors leading off it. Each dormitory off the hallway used wizarding expansion charms within to make them much bigger than the spacing of the doors would otherwise indicate. He also discovered, of the first-year boys, they were paired to a room, except him. He was the lucky one to have a room to himself. Neville was in a room with a boy named Ernie Macmillan, and the other 2 boys, Justin Finch Fletchley and Wayne Hopkins, also shared a room. Harry was suspicious it was the castle's house elves that chose him to have the single room of the 5. He found out much later he was right and that he missed that he was the fifth if the names were listed alphabetically. The house elves had, though, originally put his effects in the owner's suites. It was while they were enjoying dinner that the hat communicated with the elves to move him, Harry, into the badger seat. And it was the house elves who also set up the roost for Fawkes and turned his single window for his room into an owl window, just in case Fawkes chose to fly in or out rather than flame in or out. Macmillan saw it and exclaimed, "Hey, how is it Potter rates a private room?" Hawking replied, "There are 5 of you. There is 2 to a room, no more. Do the math." "But, why Potter?" he demanded. "I'm the heir of an important house, too." Harry sighed, stepped towards Macmillan and raised his right hand vertically, palm in. "Mr. Macmillan, while you are the heir of an important house, take a look at my ring, or, should I say, rings. I'll also remind you that, while I am legally considered only an heir, I'm actually the head of houses." Macmillan took one look, blanched and stuttered, sorry. Yes, I see. My apologies. And quickly entered his assigned room. Neville snickered while the other 2 looked slightly confused. "While you might be the heir or even head of a house or houses, Mr. Potter," said Hawking. "That is irrelevant in Hufflepuff." "I know," said Harry, turning to him. "But Mr. Macmillan needed a slap down. And I was obviously the one who had to give it to him." "I'll have words with him about his behavior," smirked Hawking. "That's why I'm a prefect." When Harry entered his room, it was to find Fawkes had already made himself at home. He had a comfortable roost, a tray under him to catch the ash when he had his burning days, a side tray of water on one side and a tray of dried chili and peppers on the other. His preferred snack food. Harry also found his things had been unpacked and the elves had done their best to set things up for him. Harry found out from Neville the next morning that Hawking was as good as his word and gave Macmillan a telling off. And then reminded Macmillan that Neville, his dorm mate, was also an heir of an important house. The next morning Harry was already up and out of bed when Hawking came past and made sure he was awake. "Good," he'd said. "You had a shower, too, right?" "Yes," replied Harry. "Thank you for checking." Hawking gave a nod and said, "Common room in 15 minutes. Then pulled his head out and walked on. Harry and Neville both were there in 5. They were glad, too, as so were Hannah and Susan. As soon as the girls saw them they practically forced them both into chairs and, moving to behind them, started working on their hair. Harry had forgotten all about it until the last minute and had both his brush and one of his gray silk ribbons in his school satchel. Neville, apparently, was the same. But, he'd pre-prepared while Harry, not so much. A couple of minutes later and Susan was finishing up tying Harry's hair ribbon at the base of his neck as Hannah did the same with Neville's. "Can anyone get in on this?" asked one of the male upper years. "If you bring down your ribbon and hairbrush and we've got time, why not?" replied Susan. That had a couple of the other girls confessing they'd be willing to do it too. One of the seniors muttered, "Why didn't we think of this before? This is a great idea." When the rest of the first years all began to gather in the common room there were lots of, "How'd you sleep?" "Sleep well." And even, "Aren't these beds comfortable?" That sort of thing. Of the friends, Neville asked their 2 girls, "Who, on your side, got the single room?" "Sally Ann Perks," said Susan. Then she leaned in and quietly whispered, "She has a prosthesis in place of her right lower leg and foot. It's this metal and plastic contraption. She had to have a special bathroom made for when she bathes. You wouldn't know it from the way she walks," whispered Hannah. "Mad-Eye Moody really hobbles." "That's because the Muggle world is a lot better at making such devices, Hannah," Harry quietly said. "Moody's leg would be what the Muggles had back about 150 years ago. The Muggles have not stopped improving on that design. And they're not likely to stop for a long time to come. Hell, I've seen people on television run in races, which as far as he got before he was interrupted by Jemima Marchbanks. "We're all here," called Jemima, getting their attention. "Time to go and get breakfast. This time I want you all to try and remember the route we take back to the Great Hall. I know most of you were far too tired last night to try that then. Let's go." As had been taught them, they arrived to have plenty of time to enjoy breakfast, then the professors started handing out their timetables, then the owl mail all arrived in one big flock, parliament, of owls flying in from somewhere within the hidden ceiling. "Oh dear," said Harry. Looking to Susan he said, "Weren't we supposed to send letters to Aunt Amy last night to let her know what houses we were sorted into?" "No, silly," she replied. "Today. She knew we'd be too tired last night. But, that changed when she knew she'd be here this afternoon, remember?" He nodded and said, "You're right. But, mind if I borrow Hedwig to send one to Sirius?" She shrugged and replied, "No. Besides, she likes you and never minds the work." Harry would never dream of using Fawkes as a male owl. Though they did not know what classes they'd have on when yet, Harry had already loaded his school satchel with 2 bottles of ink, a case of quills and a small stack of parchment. He knew he'd need at least those. He quickly pulled out ink, quill and parchment and dashed off a quick letter to Sirius letting him know he and the other 3 had all been sorted into Hufflepuff. He also admitted they'd planned it that way so they could all stay together in one house. However, he did not think it would come as much of a surprise to Sirius they all chose to go into the one house, at any rate. After classes that afternoon, their first day of lessons, as told by the headmistress the previous night, they all immediately made their way to the Great Hall and sat at their house tables. Present were Amelia Bones, in her role as minister, her aide, Cynthia, now one of her 2 under-secretaries, 2 unspeakables with one of them with their hood flipped off, Saul Croker, and a small contingent of media standing off to one side. Standing on the floor almost hard up against the dais were 4 easels with what appeared to be paintings upon them. Each appeared identical in size and each was covered with a black cloth. Harry, Susan and Hannah all knew exactly what they were, the portraits of the 4 founders. Standing between the 2 middle portraits was a small table with a few covered items upon them, each covered with a doll-sized, black sheet of its own. Once it looked like everyone had arrived, the headmistress announced Aunt Amy as Minister Bones, and allowed the woman the floor. Standing next to the table, the minister looked to the headmistress and said, "I believe you and your staff should join your students, headmistress. You're not going to want to miss any of this and you would not properly see if you all remain sitting up there." So, for the first time in so long that nobody could even remember when, the staff all went and sat at the tables of the students. From a long ago established habit, Professor McGonagall went and sat at the Gryffindor table while the rest of the staff spread themselves out among the others in similar fashion. Once they were all seated, the minister smiled and said, "A little over 6 weeks ago I met the most incredible person. I will not say who that was, as I believe I would immediately be thought as someone who was losing their mind and should be placed in the St. Mungo's ward for the mentally enfeebled if I was to do so. However, during that meeting they provided me with a great deal of information. For example, they informed me of the location of certain historical artifacts long thought lost." First, she said before pulling one of the small sheets off one of the items on the table. Then she picked it up. "I have been informed and have had it confirmed that this is the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw." That had a great collective gasp rise from all those in the hall, staff, students and visiting dignitaries alike. The photographers were taking photographs as fast as their hands could work. As she then placed it back on the table she said, "I believe I should leave this here for now. I have more to unveil for you first." Then she pulled another sheet away and picked the item underneath up by its chain and held it aloft. "This is the missing locket of Salazar Slytherin. Again, I've had it authenticated." Yet another gasp from the audience and yet more photographs were taken. Placing it back on the table she then flicked away the next sheet and picked the item up by one of its handles and held it, too, aloft. "And this is the fabled cup of Helga Hufflepuff. That was also returned to the table after a delay for photographs. I know there are still other much valued artifacts of the founders still missing," she calmly continued. "However, I know where another is at this moment and will have it brought here." She held her offhand up, a la Dumbledore, and called, "Fawkes." When the bird responded to her call and alighted on her arm, many were amazed. No one, but Harry and his family and friends, knew what had happened to the immortal bird after the death of Dumbledore. Even the other Hufflepuffs did not yet know Fawkes was now staying in Harry's private dormitory room. She whispered something to the bird and it flamed away, a moment later and it was back with the sorting hat clutched in its talons, dropping it into Bones's outstretched hands. "Blasted bird," the hat grumbled aloud. With a smirk, Bones then donned the hat and seemed to have a short conversation with it mind to mind. "I see," said the hat. Bones then removed the hat and held it with her offhand, but lying somewhat flat. A moment later it seemed to twist itself almost into a knot in her hand. Quickly, she reached into the hat with her right hand under the brim and, with almost a flourish, she pulled the hand under down and away to her right while pulling the upper hand with the hat gripped up and away to the left. As quick as that, Bones was holding the sorting hat in her left hand and a long sword in her right, gripped by the hilt. She placed the sorting hat on the table and raised the longsword up so it laid flat on the palm of her now empty offhand and said, "The long-lost sword of Godric Gryffindor." And turned the sword over slightly so the people closest could just make out the name Gryffindor written down the blade in Old English script. That, of course, was the staff. By then the shock was so deep that only one or two people actually gasped again. She then carefully laid the sword down on the table to join the other three important and historical artifacts, one each, of the four founders. Many books have been written about each of these items, she said. Many thoughts have been spoken aloud about whatever became of them. She gestured to the table and said, "Now, here they are." Again camera flashes were going off a mile a second. But, of course, Bones was not done yet. Sudden applause started up, but Bones immediately raised her hand in a stop gesture. "Please wait. There is one more thing to do." When she knew she was successful in halting the applause before it even properly started, she turned about to face the portraits, drew her wand and vanished the black sheets over the portraits. All four founders were awake and immediately grinned. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Bones. "From your left to right, I present to you the authenticated portraits of Salazar Slytherin, Rowena Ravenclaw, Helga Hufflepuff and Godric Gryffindor." All four portraits laughed and gestured with waves to whoever they saw looking at them at the time. Bedlam. If what then immediately transpired in the Great Hall after that could be referred to by a single word, it was bedlam. From a quiet susurration of gasps of shock, cries of disbelief and applause, the noise quickly rose to a crescendo of loud applause, cheering and other yelling. Bones just stood there with a wide grin, staring at Harry and the other three. The photographers then finally managed to break past the few Aurors who'd managed to corral them until that point, closed in on Bones and were madly snapping away even more photographs. The sheer amount created an almost strobe-like effect of lights and the air above them became so murky with purple smoke haze from the magical flash bulbs you couldn't even really see through it. It took a good 2 minutes before the Aurors were able to force them all back to the side of the room again. Once they were back, Bones said, "I'll now take questions from anyone, but the media, at this time. That means especially staff and students of the school. The press can wait until later." A seventh-year Ravenclaw shot to his feet and asked, "Madam, sorry. Minister Bones." "Yes," she asked and quickly added, "How about you introduce yourself, first?" "Sorry," he said. "Peter Martin, seventh-year prefect for Ravenclaw." "Yes, Mr. Martin. As whoever it was who told you where to find all this allowed you to find it all, I think it's safe to say you could tell us who that was. I mean, it would have to be believable then, right?" She smirked back, seemed to think about it for a moment before finally replying, "Sorry, no. If I was to tell you who that was, the very next set of questions would be related to how I managed to meet them. And that would place the security and privacy of a young and still living person at risk." "So, it was a young seer?" he pressed. She grinned and replied, "You can believe that." She never said it was true, but implying it was a seer who was responsible was a perfect cover for the truth. She quickly glanced at Croaker, who was smirking. He gave a very slight head nod back, meaning he agreed with the idea. A sixth-year Slytherin, who had been beaten to his feet by the seventh year, claw by half a heartbeat, called out, "Everett Bull. How do we know those are really the portraits of the founders?" Salazar laughed and said, "Because I told the unspeakables how to find and get into what you modern folks call the Chamber of Secrets under the castle, Mr. Bull. They'll be doing that over the next couple of days. However, no one else will be allowed in there until those experienced with dealing with such enter and deal with the basilisk I placed in there and under stasis. After that, and with the permission of your headmistress, I cannot see why a lucky few cannot be allowed to go inside and confirm its existence for everyone else." That had the sixth year stumped for a disagreeing response, so he sat again. "Who verified and authenticated those are really the artifacts of the founders on the table?" asked a sixth year, Claw. "Oh, and I'm Darren Hilliard." "The unspeakables did, Mr. Hilliard," she replied. "Except for the sword, which they'll authenticate once we finish here. However, as I drew it from the sorting hat, I cannot see it not being the real thing. It is, said the hat, a touch firmly. It's been inside me since Godric put it there himself, except on 3 occasions when I allowed it to be drawn in defense of the school. This time is the only time I've allowed it to be drawn when not in defense of the school. There were a few more questions, but most just wanted to approach and look at the artifacts and portraits more closely. With the Aurors standing close watch, the students were allowed to approach in small groups. Once everyone who wanted to get up close to see them for themselves had done so, the artifacts were supposedly temporarily taken back to the ministry by the minister, while the staff, with assistance by the unspeakables, set up a physically and magically secure way to store them on display within the school. In reality, the items were temporarily stored in a corner of the school's trophy room under a Fidelius charm. As for the portraits, they immediately went up onto the wall in the Great Hall, exactly, they claimed, where they were when they were taken down by a headmaster who did not like to hear them constantly complaining to him about how the school was being run. Even the mounts for the portraits were still there and could be seen if you knew where to look. The portraits were returned to their places and locked into place with house elf magic. The next morning Harry was woken early by a house elf, who asked him to come to the Great Hall before everyone else was awake, to perform a small task for the school. When Harry arrived, the portraits, especially Rowena, led him through how to channel the magic of the school through the Elder Wand and into the locking charms on the portraits so no one would ever again be able to remove them from the walls. Harry did so. Now, the only way the portraits could be removed was if the Great Hall was removed. The portraits were there for good. I'd best get back to my room, said Harry. I don't want to give people any idea I'm more than just a Potter, that boy who lived nonsense, aside. Thank you, Harry, they each said. And he quickly hurried back to the seat. When Harry and his friends headed for the Great Hall for breakfast, or, in Harry's case, returned to the Great Hall, they joined others in witnessing the wonderful entertainment the senior years of House Slytherin were putting on for everyone. In a completely un-Slytherin-like manner, they were actually arguing with the portrait of Salazar Slytherin. At least, that's what they thought they were doing. Salazar, however, was having a high old time. Every time one of the idiots tried to tell him he was wrong about something, he'd come back with something along the lines of, well, as I have the full memories of the living Salazar Slytherin right up until he died, then I know the actual truth, do I not? The real Salazar Slytherin was not a blood bigot. If anything, he was less of a bigot when it came to blood than even Godric. No, if there was a blood bigot between us, Rowena was the bigot. However, her bigotry was between those of noble and not birth, not how far back their bloodlines went. Then he absolutely shocked them when he said his own mother was what modern witches and wizards called a muggleborn. I didn't hate muggleborns, you morons, I hated muggles. And not all of them, either. That's because there were certain muggles happily going about the place trying to kill every witch and wizard they could get their hands on. In return I could happily, and did, slaughter every one of those I found. Those mongrels killed far too many of my students. Hell, even killing one of my young students was enough for me to kill them. I didn't care if they were afraid of witches or wizards. Bigotry exists in many forms. I cared if they harmed witches or wizards as a result of that fear. But, only purebloods, right? Asked one of the Slytherins. Wrong, you numbskull. Salazar immediately snapped back. How, on God's green earth, did you end up in my house with thinking like that? Where's the cunning? You're certainly not displaying any of it when you utter remarks like that. When I said any of my students, I meant any of my students. I know the history books state I was supposedly some blood bigot, however, I most certainly was not. Use your brains and think about it. Listen to what you're being told. Figure it out. All the evidence you need is before you. When it didn't appear that the Slytherins had figured it out, he sighed, rolled his eyes and said, if there was one house in Hogwarts that could be considered the house of the Muggleborns, it was Slytherin. While we were teaching, my house had more Muggleborns within it than the other 3, combined. And, out of those, the next closest was Helga's. Year by year it was a horseshoe toss between Godric's and Rowena's who had the least. No, it can't be, exclaimed one of the Slytherins speaking with the portrait. Why, you're lying. Yes, it is. Salazar happily snarked back. I'm not. Rowena's portrait, next closest, laughed and said, he's not. We can confirm that. Us other three used to laugh at Sal all the time and call him the Muggleborn's adopted grandfather. The Muggleborns, especially the first years and some of the second years, used to follow him around like he was the alpha dog leading about a pack of puppies. That had both other portraits laughing along with her. Salazar's portrait mock scowled back. That afternoon Harry heard that some over-officious idiot from the ministry who called himself the chief historian of the Ministry of Magic, with an overweening sense of his own self-importance, had turned up at the school with the intent of taking the portraits back to the ministry so they could be carefully studied for historical purposes. While he didn't bring Aurors with him, he did bring 2 other ministry workers. With even McGonagall tearing strips off him, he still tried to remove them from the walls. And kept trying until Bones herself turned up, told him to leave them the hell alone, and ordered him back to the ministry. When he tried to bluster his way out of it, she flatly told him, "Leave, now, or you can clean out your desk. Leave now, or you're fired. You're only acting minister," he tried. "I've seen to the return of 8 missing important historical artifacts related to the school in particular and the wizarding world in general," she snapped. "Do you honestly think I will not be fully elected this afternoon? Are you that stupid you think someone else will soon be the new minister? Who would be foolish enough to even stand against me? I think I could just about execute you 3 in the middle of the lobby at the ministry, simply for pissing me off, and still get elected as minister. Now, get out. Get out of this school, right this minute, or I will not even wait until you return to your desk before I have 2 of Director Scrimgeour's Aurors there waiting to escort you from the premises and ensure you never work in a position of authority ever again." Then she wheeled on the 2 flunkies and said, "And, if he goes, so do you. You've both clearly shown yourselves to be as stupid as he is." When the 3 quickly left the school, almost running in their efforts to depart, she looked to the portraits and said, "Sorry about that." "That's all right, lass," grinned Godric. "They'd have never gotten us off the wall, anyway. A certain someone used their authority to employ the magics of the castle to ensure we can never be removed again." Bones smirked back and nodded. She knew who they meant. She then wheeled on a clearly worried until she'd turned up McGonagall and said, "If any more idiots turn up and try to remove them, tell them you're under direct orders from me to toss their asses right back out again, with magical force, if necessary." "Thank you, Amelia," smiled McGonagall. "Happy to help," said Bones. School very quickly settled down again for everyone, or for the first time for the new first years. The students even learned Harry had a Phoenix companion, and that it was Fawkes, only a couple of days after the incident with the ministry flunkies in the Great Hall. The Badgers, of course, found out first, but it was all over the school by the end of that day. "How did Fawkes come to be your familiar?" asked one of the 3rd year puffs. "He's not," replied Harry. "At least, I don't think he is. He just started hanging around me after Dumbledore died and, though he leaves for short periods of time, always comes back. At any moment, I keep expecting him to take off and not come back." And shrugged. Though he'd told everyone who'd asked him directly that Fawkes was not his familiar, everyone in the school still believed he was. After a couple of days of it, Harry just gave up trying to correct folks. Susan noticed and suggested to him, "Maybe he is your familiar and you just don't know it." Harry couldn't find fault with her argument, so just shrugged back. He had no way to tell and did not know. There was actually a charm that could test it for him. A couple of weeks later, Professor Flitwick tested it and found Fawkes was, indeed, Harry's familiar. However, he did not find out until after he died that Thanatos, when he visited the Dursleys that day, asked the bird to bond with Harry. And Fawkes did it while Harry was in the hospital, but not until he was strong enough to accept the bond. Since the portraits of the founders had gone up and for the next few long weeks, students would often enter the Great Hall to find adult witches and wizards practically interrogating them. Alongside them would either be a dictaquill operator with a dictaquill, or they'd be writing the material themselves as fast as they could. There'd been reporters, historians and just the curious who'd come to talk with them. As the portraits were at the other end of the hall from the head table and the number of attending students at the school was currently quite low, there was often a wide gap between where the students sat at each house table and where the visiting witches and wizards sat while interrogating the portraits. As such, most students and even the staff started ignoring them after the first couple of weeks. It helped when Professors Flitwick and Babbling erected a semi-permanent ward that extended forward of the portraits for about 20 feet. That still left a further 30 feet before where the 7th years would approximately sit. As the headmistress had said in one of her announcements towards the end of the first week, the finding and returning of the 4 portraits was a golden opportunity for historians and other important personages to converse with the portraits and discover the truth of that part of the history of the magical world in general and the school in particular. And that students and staff should generally leave them alone unless they were showing themselves to be nuisances. If they were and it was a student so bothered, it was to be immediately reported to one of the professors to deal with. Before starting his first year at Hogwarts, Sirius informed Harry he'd received a letter from Uncle Mui, and was organizing a time when he would reconnect with the man. That first meeting occurred both after Sirius was out of hospital and when he felt he was well enough recovered to deal with his old friend. However, that meeting did not occur until after Harry had begun Hogwarts. 4 weeks after school started, Sirius had apparently gained permission from Headmistress McGonagall to bring Remus, Moony, Lupin to the school to reconnect with his honorary nephew. McGonagall granted it and the first meeting was organized for the coming Saturday. However, the meeting did not go all that well. Harry understood why Sirius could not visit him and rescue him from the Dursleys, as he now knew Sirius had been unjustly and illegally tossed into prison. However, Remus did not have that excuse. The man was found clear of any form of compulsion charm to keep him away, nor were there repulsion charms on the Dursley residence that would have kept a determined Remus Lupin, who would have meant no harm towards Harry, from visiting. To Harry, that meant the man had willingly chosen to remain away, and considered the excuse the man suffered, werewolfism, to be a crutch he trotted out when he wanted an excuse for something he did wrong and didn't want to face up to it. The excuse held no water with Harry. If anything, Harry thought even less of him for thinking he, Harry, would accept such an excuse. Harry told Sirius, flat out, he had no wish to meet the man, let alone rekindle a familial relationship. Sirius began to argue on his friend's behalf, but, after a look at Harry's expression, decided not to push it. As the school body had been informed, the Unspeakables had returned to the school while classes were in session, gone down to the Chamber of Secrets, killed the giant basilisk within, but left the carcass for the time being. A raffle was drawn of names of trusted students, mainly prefects across all 4 houses, but even younger years were thrown in, and a group of 24 were escorted down. Harry was one of them. On return, those students were quick to report that the portrait of Salazar Slytherin did not lie. His directions on how to find the chamber, how it appeared and what the beast was within were, in fact, accurate. Salazar's portrait just stood proudly and a little smugly in his frame, but he did not gloat. Not even when looking smugly upon the embarrassed and grouchy diners of the Slytherin table. After giving the carcass of the basilisk, as they put it, time to cure, the Unspeakables had returned with a team from Gringotts and removed it. The carcass was rendered for potion ingredients and the money raised from it made its way into the newly created bursary fund for the school. Harry had liked Bones's idea for a bursary fund, once she'd explained it to him, and the ministry created it on her direction. With nothing other than a biannual report to the ministry about its financial state, the bursary was to be wholly and jointly managed by the headmaster or mistress and their deputy. There was an incident at the school on Halloween when a young Ravenclaw first year witch named Hermione Granger had been verbally insulted so badly by the youngest Weasley boy she spent the rest of day and into the evening in the girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor. The same bathroom that housed one of the main entrances to the Chamber of Secrets. A couple of Ravenclaw girls, together with the 5th-year female Ravenclaw prefect, a Penelope Clearwater, managed to coax her out and to report the matter to Professor Flitwick. The girl had felt so intimidated and abused she was demanding to be sent home, even knowing it meant her wand would be snapped, her magic bound and she and her family being obliviated of all knowledge of the magical world. Once they'd heard of it later, it utterly horrified the staff to be told a witch would want such to happen to them. Flitwick did not let the moss grow under his feet. He immediately reported the matter to the head of house for Gryffindor, Professor Bathsheba Babbling, and demanded justice for the girl. He, or rather she, got it. Ronald Weasley was found guilty of so badly abusing the girl he was suspended from school for a week, lost 50 points for his house and would serve a further 2 weeks of detention every evening bar weekends for 2 hours each evening upon his return. He also had to publicly and formally apologize to the girl. When he refused, his punishment was doubled on the spot. He then finally apologized, but the doubling was not rescinded. From that it became clear to everyone that certain behavior would absolutely no longer be tolerated. Abuse, even specifically targeted verbal abuse, would bring the hammer of authority down upon you. Some students were a bit slow in learning that, but even they got it when that hammer was brought down upon them. The same Weasley boy had also tried all too often to make Harry see him as his best mate. And that, even though according to Weasley Harry wasn't sorted into the right house, Weasley would forgive him that mistake. After what happened to the Granger girl, after Weasley returned to the school following his 2-week suspension, and the next time the Bloodnut tried to approach him, Harry just glared at him and demanded, "What do you want, bully?" Tried Weasley, not expecting to either be spoken to that way or glared at in such a cold manner. "What a man you have proven yourself to be by picking on a defenseless girl," sneered Harry. "Is that what it means to be a Gryffindor, these days? We no longer rescue damsels in distress, we abuse them. I think I'll be asking the headmistress if I can visit with the Sorting Hat to profusely thank it for not sorting me into Gryffindor, the house of the idiot bullies." Harry then showed him his rings and said, "You know what this means, right?" When Weasley had paled and nodded back, Harry said, "Stop trying to be my so-called best friend. Stop lying to people and telling them I am your best friend. Or I'll stand in the Great Hall and publicly announce the truth to everyone. Do you understand?" Again, Weasley nodded, now clearly terrified. "Good," snapped Harry. "Now stay the hell away from me and stop picking on girls." Weasley all but ran off in fear. However, he stopped with his crap right then and there. Mind you, that could have also been because, as Harry found out later, his 3 older brothers had taken him aside for some important family time, which had the youngest 2 of the 3, the twins, also spend time in detention with point losses and the bully needing wand work from Madame Pomfrey, the school medi-witch, to heal bruises and other contusions he'd earned. Another interesting event for Harry was when the skinny boy with slicked back and overly gelled white hair, that nearly got into a duel with Weasley in the antechamber on their first night in the school and now wearing a Slytherin uniform, had sauntered over, sneered at him and called him Scarhead. Harry remembered seeing him about the place and that his name was Drago, or something. He smirked back at the boy, quickly drew a small slip of parchment out of his bag, wrote down contact details for the specialist eye healer who'd attended him in St. Mungo's and handed it to the boy. "What's this?" Drago demanded. Harry flicked up his fringe, pointed at his forehead and said, "No scar." Then he turned his head slightly and pointed at the gray ribbon tying his hair back, heir apparent's ribbon. And finally held up his right hand, palm in, and used his offhand to point at the combined ring on his ring finger and added, "And then there's this." Lowering his hand he said, "I figured you're having trouble with your eyesight." Then indicated the slip still in Drago's hand. "That's the contact details for a good eye healer at St. Mungo's. Have one of your housemates read it to you. You clearly need the man's help." As all the younger Hufflepuffs laughed, Drago, turned red in combined embarrassment and anger, spun about and stormed off. When he'd reached the Slytherin table, some older year Slytherin snatched at him by his lapels and forcefully dragged him down and onto a bench. Then started to snarl something nasty at the boy behind some sort of silencing field, which had Drago almost crying by the end of it. Harry wasn't bothered by him again, at least, for quite a while. First year proved Harry was as bright and intelligent as others had stated he was, especially Mrs. Pickerniny and Auntie Pauline. He scored quite high marks, right from the start. Everyone was pleased. Christmas break was described by Harry again as brilliant. His return to school for the second term was even better than the first, that is, there was less drama. A break for Easter, then into the final term. His end-of-year marks were also quite high. He didn't score in the top 5, but he was definitely in the top 10. The girl from Ravenclaw who Weasley had abused began to spend a little time with them now and then, especially when they were in the library, and became friends with Susan and Hannah. She did end up in the top 5, in the top 3, actually. After the long summer break, where Harry spent more time with his godfather at his godfather's new place, the now 5 friends returned to school. Other than the first night and night of the sorting of new first years, second year was even more peaceful than the first year. However, right at the start, Harry was confused why everyone was so happy that the previous year's professor of Dada had returned for the year. Why not any of the others? He thought. He found out later it was because they hadn't had a professor of Dada stay longer than a single year in over 2 decades. On the night of the Sorting Hat, instead of singing one of its doggerel songs, made an announcement. That announcement was that it had been set straight on how students were to be sorted, and that would be as when he first started sorting back in the 11th century. If any second year or up student complained about it, they were to be immediately resorted. If any new first-year student complained about it, he suggested they sought their education elsewhere. It led to quite a few surprises for some students. For example, quite a few Muggleborns found themselves sorted into Slytherin, and some purebloods, who felt they'd, automatically, be bound for Slytherin, were not. In 2 cases, 2 of them ended up in Gryffindor. Up on the head table, Headmistress McGonagall held her forehead in her hands with her elbows on the table before her. Her head was slowly shaking back and forth. One of the surprises was the second last student sorted, a Ginevra Weasley. She went into Slytherin. Her 4 brothers in Gryffindor near rioted on the spot. That led the Hat to demanding the 2 Weasley twins be brought forth to be resorted. When he was refused, he refused to continue and sort the last student, a Yancy Isabel. The poor girl sat there, almost in tears, with the Hat saying out loud, "I will not sort this lovely young lady until both Frederick and George Weasley are brought forward and resorted." When the twins refused to come forward, Harry silently used his wand, the Elder Wand, under table, and softly whispered, "Lock down." Every window shutter, the teacher's entrance door and the main doors into the hall all slammed shut. The Hat, knowing it was Harry who did that and why, then declared, "No one leaves until Frederick and George Weasley step forward for resorting. Then I will decide who is next." Finally, both Weasley twins came forward and, very shortly after that, found themselves heading for the Slytherin table, clearly dejected. As they walked, the Hat firmly asked, "Anyone else want to complain? Now's your chance to be resorted." Before anyone could, though, the portrait of Rowena Ravenclaw called out loud enough for all to hear, "Anyone above first year who believes they were missorted, now is your chance to correct that mistake, if it was a mistake." Surprisingly, 1 third-year Slytherin stood and calmly called, "I complain." "You're a poo-poo head, Sorting Hat." That had a few laugh, and even the Hat chuckled at that one. "Then step forth, Mr. Gibbard. And let's get you resorted." He went into Gryffindor. Harry heard on the G-Vine later the boy was a half-blood and treated like crap by his housemates in Slytherin. Offered the chance to escape the house, he leapt at it. Miss Isabel eventually went into Slytherin. The next day, apparently, there were quite a few visits from irate parents and guardians, the loudest of which was Molly Weasley, matriarch of the Weasley household. She had to be stunned, bound and taken through the flow back to the Weasley family home in Ottery Street, Catchpole, the borough. She was taken there by the head of House Slytherin, Professor Septima Vector. She did not return. Mind you, unknown to anyone else and guided by the portraits of the 4 founders, Harry subtly adjusted the wards so her magical signature was blocked from the grounds. She'd apparently tried a few times more to enter, even coming to the school via the fireplace in the 3 Broomsticks Tavern in Hogsmeade and trying to walk in through the front gate, but was blocked in every attempt. It took until Christmas for that furore to die down. On returning to the school after the Christmas break, it was to see the Weasley twins, plus their little sister, all wearing Gryffindor colors. However, they'd no sooner walked into the Great Hall and sat at the Gryffindor table when Godric saw them, called a house elf and had it pass a message to McGonagall, sitting at the head table. McGonagall waited until the students, bar the new first years, were all within the hall before she ordered all 3 of the misdressed Weasleys to stand. Reluctantly, they did, shamefaced. She congratulated them on a masterful prank that harmed no one, awarded them 5 points each for it, then turned around and docked them 10 points each for not sitting at their rightful table for the feast, as per school rules. Then ordered them back to the Slytherin table. As they walked, there was a flash upon each of them of house elf magic, and their robes reverted to Slytherin trim. Harry found out later through the castle's house elves that it was apparently their mother who retrimmed their robes from Slytherin to Gryffindor, whether the staff like it or not. Apparently, she completely forgot that their personal possessions, when taken from the train to their quarters, would have been put into Slytherin anyway. Just after the Easter break, Professor Sprout took each second year aside and talked to them about what electives they'd undertake the next year. Harry quickly chose arithmancy and ancient runes, which pleased his head of house. He'd wanted to talk to his 4 friends first, just to find out what they'd be taking, but decided they would probably pick either the same or very similar. Susan chose the same as him, Hannah chose ancient runes and Muggle studies, Neville chose ancient runes and care of magical creatures, but Hermione chose the same 2 subjects as he and Susan plus a third, Muggle studies. She'd wanted to choose all 5, but she was firmly told by her own head of house, Professor Flitwick, that such would not be possible. That had the girl miffed for a couple of weeks, but her response only amused the other 4. Susan reasonably asked, as there are only 3 separate allotted times for electives in the class schedules, just when would you be doing those other 2? Hermione quickly borrowed a 3rd year's class schedule and confirmed what Susan had said. But, what if someone, like me, wanted to do 5? Harry smirked and replied, well, you can always repeat the year and take the other 2 then. Hermione frowned and pouted at him before giving him a gentle whack on top of the head with one of her textbooks. That's not funny, she muttered. After wincing slightly from the whack, he shot back, but it is practical. The only other annoyance for the year, for Harry, was the Weasley girl constantly trying to follow him about whenever he wasn't in class or the Hufflepuff common room. He never knew why she stopped until after he'd graduated, when Susan owned up to it, but Hannah and she had lain in wait for the girl while she was trying to surreptitiously follow Harry, grabbed her, dragged her into an unused classroom and verbally laid into her with all sorts of dire threats. Susan had already laid claim to Harry and, little Miss Weasley, had better stop trying to poach him. In 3rd year there arose another drama. However, it was not within the school. Someone had tried to resurrect a tournament of old, the Tri-Wizard Tournament, and had started to make plans and the like to have it hosted at Hogwarts for the 1994-95 school year. McGonagall was told by the ministry official it would happen, whether she liked it or not. She then, apparently, contacted Bones and told her what she'd been told. Bones then confronted the ministry official, who turned out to be a Ludovic Bagman, and he was ordered to tell her what the hell he thought he was doing. In very short order, Bagman was fired, with his files gone through to find out how far and how deeply his plans had developed. What plans he'd already initiated were immediately cancelled and people already contacted were recontacted and informed otherwise. The Tri-Wizard Tournament is dead and will remain dead, everyone was told. Even if someone else in another country is stupid enough to try and resurrect it, Hogwarts will not be an attending school, as tradition would otherwise dictate. No one disagreed and the nearly revived tournament was dead before it was even close to being reborn. The only scandal that arose from it was Bagman, now about to face wizarding British justice, fleeing and being caught illegally port-keying into Makusa, immediately being arrested as a wanted felon by Goblin courts and subsequently being handed over to them. The man was never seen again. Apparently, he owed the Goblins significant gambling debts and had tried to use the Tri-Wizard Tournament as a way for him to skim heavily from the tournament budget, as well as make illegal bets behind the scenes to raise the necessary gold he needed to repay his debts. The Goblins were not amused. Nor was Minister Bones or Director Scrimgeour, when they found out through the Makusa ambassador to Wizarding Britain they wouldn't be getting him back when they had wanted to put him on trial for what they'd learned after he'd scarpered. During the summer break between 3rd and 4th year, Harry was Sirius's special guest in the Minister's box at the Quidditch World Cup. Harry was highly amused, as he would have been in that box as Minister Bones's ward, anyway. However, Sirius told him, "This way, you're my guest, not Amos. You realize, don't you, that you're her guest as it's her box, which means I'm her guest, too, anyway," argued Harry. Sirius just blew him a raspberry in response, which had Harry laughing back to the point he was almost in tears from laughing so hard. Later, Harry realized that was probably Sirius's intent all along. Bulgaria won a very exciting and very quick match, 150 to 140, with all of their points arising just from their star player and seeker, Victor Krum, catching the snitch a bare few seconds before Ireland scored a goal that would have tied the match. Sirius had mock-wailed at the injustice of it all. He claimed Bulgaria only won because the referee, some guy from Egypt named Mustafa, who Sirius had immediately nicknamed Mustache, Due to the huge amount of bushy lip hair the man sported under his nose and which effectively covered his mouth with overhang, and wasn't as quick on the whistle acknowledging brilliant Irish goals as he should have been. If he'd been faster with the whistle, Ireland would have racked up 160 points in goals before that poncy Bulgarian, Crumb, managed to catch the snitch. He'd argued. Harry came away from the match thinking how exciting the game actually looked when played at this level. He then started to give serious thought to trying out for the Hufflepuff team at Hogwarts. However, he already knew his best position was as seeker, and the current Badger seeker, Cedric Diggory, would be in 7th year this year. If Diggory stuck the year out as seeker, he'd have a year to train under Diggory to replace him. He'd talk to Diggory about it when school recommenced. The next morning Harry learned from his Aunt Amy that a small group of, as she put it, half-drunk malcontents had started to cause a ruckus about an hour after the match finished and over in a different part of the campground. The Aurors were very quick on the scene and had them rapidly subdued. One of them was the previous minister's senior undersecretary, one Dolores Umbridge, who was spotted and subsequently caught casting the Cruciatus curse on the Muggle campground manager. She was heading for a lifetime sentence in Azkaban. Of the half-dozen or so others, 4 of them were also caught. And they were all caught wearing full Death Eater regalia. All 4 would also soon be off to serving time at Azkaban. There'd be no using the Imperious Curse defense, this time. "Anyone we know?" asked Susan. "2 are the fathers of yearmits of yours," replied Bones. "Crabbe and Goyle." Harry laughed and said, "They're 2 of a few in Slytherin that Grandpa Sal goes on rants about. They're 2 that led me having to go down to the Great Hall during the dead of night one night in 1st year and asking Fawkes to bring the portraits the Sorting Hat. Grandpa Sal thought the enchantments on the Sorting Hat had to be beginning to fail for those 2 to have ended up in Slytherin. As I'd mentioned soon after it, that's what led to that astounding night of the sorting at the start of our 2nd year. I thought that was all one big massive prank," said Sirius. He sounded disappointed it wasn't. "Nope," Harry smirked. "I think Grandpa Sal was hoping both those idiots thought about asking for a resort and he'd have an excuse to get them out of his house." It was also during that summer and, after some very directed and pointed prodding from his godfather and Neville, that Harry finally got up the nerve to ask Susan to be his girlfriend. Neville and Hannah had become boyfriend and girlfriend a couple of months before the end of the school year. Her response: "Well, it's about bloody time, Potter. I was just about to give up on you." Then she snogged him. Harry came away from that confrontation with a dopey grin on his face and lipstick on his lips and cheeks. Aunt Amy, the first to spot the pair of them immediately after, developed a pained expression, used her offhand fingers to massage the bridge of her nose, sighed and said, "Just don't get carried away and progress things too fast. That's all I ask." As 4th year got underway, after the first few days and on the Sunday, Harry approached Diggory and asked to be apprenticed under him for the seeker's position. Diggory replied, "You're the 3rd. As I said to the first 2, meet me down on the Quidditch pitch next, this Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and I'll give you a chance to show your skills. The best performer gets the chance to train under me." "Brill," said Harry. "Thanks, Cedric." Cedric smiled and replied, "You're welcome. However, just because your name's Harry Potter does not mean the position's yours." "No, that's great," said Harry. "If I found out you'd picked me because of that, I'd turn it down. This is Hufflepuff. We play fair in Hufflepuff." Cedric grinned and said, "That attitude is exactly what I like to see." Harry had asked his godfather to send him his broom, but, instead of sending him his Nimbus, Sirius sent him a brand new firebolt. The note with it said, "Harry, this was going to be a Christmas present. However, it sounds like you will probably need it now. If you get the position, I'll also go out and buy you the armor you're going to need. Good luck. However, I don't think you're going to need it. I've already seen what you can do on a broom." Sirius. Harry tried out for the slot and easily beat out the other 3. Another asked after he did, and Diggory immediately put him on the team as both a trainee and as reserve seeker. Harry then joined them for all the training sessions. 4th year turned out to be another quiet year. There were no major ructions, either at the school or elsewhere. Harry and Susan's relationship was nicely progressing with, just before they broke for the Easter break, Harry finally got a chance to get his hands on Susan's S without her immediately batting them away. He knew, in comparison to the other girls in their year, that Susan's were large. Only Millicent Bulstrode in Slytherin had bigger, he thought, but she was also a big girl. However, he didn't care as he knew Susan's would feel marvelous in his hands. They did. Now he had to work on getting his hands on her under her robes. Harry never got a chance to play in a proper inter-house Quidditch game that year, but Diggory made sure he was given plenty of training with the rest of the team. There were times during training when Diggory, as team captain, just flew about coaching the other players while Harry searched for the snitch. Diggory also taught him the various ways to seek that improved one's chances to be the first to spot the snitch. He taught him how to distract and fake out the other seeker and how those same tactics could be used against him. He taught him about focusing on bright days to look for the glint off the snitch, rather than the snitch itself. He also showed him the boundaries for which the snitch was charmed to remain within, but advised him that a strong wind could, for a few moments, blow the snitch outside those boundaries. And he taught him a lot more, besides. Harry absorbed the lot and was willing and eager to learn even more. Diggory was a strategic seeker. He had a strategy on how he was going to seek on the day, based on weather and light conditions and which team they were playing against. However, he also said that Harry had already shown himself to be an intuitive seeker. Harry was able to subconsciously determine where he needed to be looking and what he needed to do to be the first to the snitch. It sounds odd, explained Diggory. But an intuitive seeker nearly always makes a better seeker than a strategic seeker. Personally, I think it's because an intuitive seeker has a touch of the seer about them. Whatever it is, it works. It's a strength, so, when strategy seems to be failing you, go with your gut. Over the first 3 years of Harry's Hogwarts education, Slytherin won the Quidditch Cup the first year, Ravenclaw won it the second year and Gryffindor won it the third year. This year Slytherin won it, but Hufflepuff had been close to pipping the S's for the win. Harry was determined Hufflepuff would win it for the next 3. This year the Weasley twins had returned to playing Quidditch, but they now played for Slytherin. As a beating pair they were phenomenal. Harry knew they'd be trying to get him off his broom next year, as they'd tried the same with Diggory this year. He'd be trying to develop a strategy that would counter the ones they employed against Diggory. For a start, he knew they were on matching Clean Sweep 5s and the Firebolt was both faster and more maneuverable, that meant he could outfly them. However, that would also cut down on his ability to seek. He knew he'd figure something out, though, so would let it percolate in the back of his mind until a workable strategy came out. As for his schooling, he was having a ball. Just like his friend, Neville, he was a reasonably powerful wizard. However, he also knew he had a bit of an advantage over the boy by secretly being the owner of the Elder Wand. Of that, he was most pleased that Aunt Amy had managed to cast a Fidelius charm with her as the secret keeper that was both simple and effective. The secret was, the wand used by Henry James Potter, commonly known as Harry Potter, is both the same wand used by Albus Dumbledore and is the Elder Wand. That was it. He'd had a few people comment on how unusual it looked due to the 4 groups of berries around the shaft from the hilt to a couple inches short of the tip, but no one had ever put it together that it looked identical to the wand Albus Dumbledore was known to use, or that it was the Elder Wand. When people asked if it was Ollivander made, he'd just reply, nope. It was made by an old family friend no longer in the wand-making business. It's a one-off. No one ever questioned him any further on it. Harry was sent the prefect's badge for Hufflepuff when he received his book list for 5th year. Sirius, Amelia and Susan all wanted to celebrate with him and for him. However, when he found out Hannah was offered the prefect's badge for the girls, he quickly called Professor Sprout and asked if he could send it back to her and she offer it to Neville instead. She admitted it was a toss-up between he and Neville for the badge, so, when Harry suggested Neville would be a better choice as he didn't want people thinking, of course Potter got the badge, he's Harry Bloody Potter, isn't he? She relented and awarded it to Neville. Everyone, bar Sirius, was pleased with that. But it took Harry only explaining his reasoning for it for Sirius to then agree. However, Sirius was told the second part of the truth that Harry hadn't told anyone else. Harry wanted Neville to have it so he'd get to spend more time with Hannah. You're being a good wand partner by getting your mate more snogging time with his girl, exclaimed Sirius, understanding. Now, that I can get behind. knew they were in their OWL year and that their OWL exams were held at the end of the year. When they finally reached their ninth professor they'd met, for the first time that year, in this case, Professor Flitwick in charms, Harry just about breathed a sigh of relief. However, there were two students, they shared charms with Slytherin this year, that had the little professor laugh when he spotted them roll their eyes. I take it you've already heard that from your other professors and quite a bit. Yes, Professor, Daphne Greengrass drolly replied, one of those he spotted rolled their eyes. It bears repeating, he smirked back. Yes, Professor, she drolly replied again, exactly the same as the first time. Funnily enough, he laughed. Even Harry smiled at that one. It was a clever comeback. They all even felt the effects of it being their OWL year right from the start. Assignments were now handed out with mentions of how long in feet, rather than inches, they needed to be. And there was more of them. He was also alerted by the new Badger Quidditch team captain, Tammy, Appleby, when training would commence. She took him aside and said, I know Cedric trained you near religiously. I expect you to show us the effects of that training right from the start. We've already been back a week, so it's time to get training underway. I've booked the pitch for first thing tomorrow morning at 6:30 a.m. We'll spend an hour and 15 on that and then it's back into the castle for breakfast. I'll let you know what we're doing for the rest of training once we can get together and discuss class schedules away from listening ears that shouldn't be listening. All right, Tammy, he replied. I'll be up and ready. She gave him a nod and a smile and moved off, looking for her next victim. Target. Harry and his friends quickly managed to get used to the new reality of their OWL year and the length of assignments. So, they were still working at a comfortable pace, even if it was a busy pace. After a year of shadowing Diggory in his role as seeker for the Badgers, the added work of playing on the Badger Quidditch team wasn't an added imposition. Thankfully, Diggory had to deal with two new players on the team the previous year, both chasers, so this year they had an established team except for Harry. Quickly, Appleby had the team working and meshing well together again, so she also started adding in a strategy of 4 chaser plays if they were really down on goal points. However, it was quickly worked out that Harry wasn't the best shot at goals, but his timings to pass the quaffle off to others in motion was excellent. This suited Appleby, no problems, as the Seekers weren't actually allowed to score. They were allowed to handle the quaffle for short periods and pass off to others, though. Their first game was against the Ravens of Ravenclaw and Harry nearly had the game won for the Badgers before the Chasers could rack the points up. However, he quickly worked out that the Ravens seeker, Cho Chang of 6th year, while supposedly a decent seeker, couldn't seem to get her head in the game. She kept trying to distract Harry with her feminine wiles, while also calling to him just how much better Cedric Diggory was as a seeker and a wizard. He also knew her to be Diggory's on-again off-again girlfriend. It did not take him long to figure out she was actually missing her boyfriend far too much to concentrate on the game, so he was keeping an eye on the scoreboard while also keeping an eye on her to see if she'd suddenly wake up and get on with why she was actually up here on a broom. He held off going after the snitch as long as possible because the tried and true team of Badger chasers were hands down far better than the chasers on the Ravens team. When it finally looked like Chong was starting to notice just how far ahead the Badgers were getting on points, Harry watched as she looked in shock at the scoreboard before she firmly shut up and focused on the seeker hunt. He laughed at her and said, "Idiot girl." Then drove his broom down. As she wasn't that far away from him at the time, she was right in behind him and only 2 broom lengths back as he dove. A quick few twists and spins as he dove, together with allowing the speed to ease off a little, and he had her right on his tail twigs when he, Wronski fainted. She never had a chance. As he pulled up with inches to spare, his offhand grasped the snitch right as he heard the whistle give a high shrill. He simply allowed the broom to slow right down while holding his hand aloft as he flew. "Potter has the snitch," he heard the announcer yell. "Potter has the snitch. The Badgers win." Chong didn't quite end up in the infirmary after her crash into the grass of the pitch, but it was a near thing. He later heard she'd ranted and raved about how Potter had tried to kill her for the rest of the afternoon and evening in the Ravenclaw Tower until someone hit her with a silencing charm and firmly told her to shut the hell up. The Wronski feint is a completely legal move, that male, Claw had yelled. He also had the snitch in his hand within 5 seconds after it, so it probably wasn't a feint, after all. You got outplayed. It up, deal with it and move on, already. Hermione had told him all about it. She's also told him, later, over the next couple of weeks Chong had then tried to badmouth him to everyone. Harry was going to confront her about it until Hermione suggested he mention it to Professor Flitwick and let him handle it. So, he did. According to Hermione, Flitwick confronted Chong about it in the middle of the Ravenclaw common room and gave her a right serve. Then deducted 20 points off her and assigned her a week's detention. And, finally, told her if her behavior was repeated, he'd pull her from the Ravens and tell the team captain she was permanently benched. That finally shut her up. Gryffindor had already played Slytherin with a Slytherin win, but it was close with the S's trailing a fair bit behind before the Slytherin seeker finally caught the snitch. As a team, the Gryffindor chasers were brilliant. Then Gryffindor played Ravenclaw with the Gryffindor Lions victorious, utterly trouncing the Ravens, just as the Badgers did. Then it was Slytherin against the Badgers. And Harry was ready. There'd be no mucking about in this game. The Slytherin beating team of Fred and George Weasley were fair, but powerful and accurate. And their chasers were, in Harry's opinion, a bunch of cheating assholes more interested in hurting opposing players and scoring more goals through player attrition than just being better players. As such, Harry would be going for the snitch right off the opening whistle. As soon as the snitch was released after the quaffle and bludgers, Harry started counting down in his mind. He knew it was exactly 5 minutes, to the second, when the snitch would first become visible after its release. He'd be using that 5 minutes. Straight away, as he expected, the Weasley twins targeted him. Anticipating that, he was up high, very high. He was almost 300 feet up and looked like a speck in the sky to the spectators. As the twins worked their bludger back and forth between then rising to meet him, Harry timed it. As they reached 20 feet below him, as soon as one twin swung their bat to hit the bludger to the other twin, he threw a half-sloth grip roll, to invert and pulled hard, up, throwing on the power and diving for the deck. He blew past the bludger, behind, and sped for the ground. He heard one twin shout, "Fucking hell," as he blew past between them. They'd just been conned and they knew it. However, they, too, were being a little clever. They abandoned the bludger and dove down after Harry, knowing the bludger would immediately dive down after them without their needing to beat it back and forth. After all, it had nowhere else to go and no other targets in the vicinity, so would head for the deck. Harry would be laughing if it wasn't for worrying about accidentally swallowing a bug while he was doing so. Instead, he was grinning his head off. In his mind he also had his countdown going on and, when he reached about 50 feet off the ground, knew the snitch should make an appearance. Now, and, as if fate itself was guiding his eyes, he spotted it almost directly underneath the goalposts at the Slytherin end a moment after it appeared. Screw the Wronski, he thought. There's seekers nowhere near me. He simply pulled up and had to firmly heave back on the broom to strongly apply the braking charms to slow down enough to snatch the snitch out of the air. He still hit it with enough force he felt the sting of it slapping into his palm, even through his glove. Wheeling hard about he held his hand aloft showing he'd caught the snitch. There was about 3 to 4 seconds of near silence before the announcer, Lee Jordan, yelled, "Bloody hell. Potter's already caught the snitch. It's over." The Badgers win 180-30. The resultant applause was almost deafening. Harry still heard Jordan's follow-on call, that would have to be one of the fastest snitch catches in history. 5 minutes, 8 seconds from game start. That catch had the whole school talking about it. The Ravenclaws were trying to figure out how he'd managed to stay on the broom considering the amount of resistance through the air he'd have been generating at the time he popped up from lying on it while trying to pull out of the dive. They'd already calculated he'd reached the maximum speed of the broom, 300 miles per hour, during the dive. Even Professor Septima Vector, the professor of arithmancy, was making calculations. The Gryffindors were arguing it was so Gryffindorish, the move it proved the hat was wrong about sorting him into the house of the Duffers, and he should have been sorted into Gryffindor, after all. They weren't interested in the dynamics, just the sheer bravery of the feat. The Slytherins were positive he'd cheated as they couldn't figure out how he'd managed to time everything to be in the right place at the right time and have the snitch just where he needed it to be to catch it so fast. The Hufflepuffs They just thought it was effing brilliant, except Susan. Within a minute after the match, Harry had found himself dragged off by an irate and determined redhead witch who shoved him into the stadium's broom closet for actual flying brooms, threw up silencing charms and proceeded to verbally rip him to shreds for his recklessness. Harry just kept grinning away until she stopped for a moment to take a deep breath. Then he grabbed her and snogged her half silly. That shut her up. Once she was suitably dazed, he left her in the closet and took off for the change rooms to change out of his Quidditch gear. By the time he was allowed to shower and change by his teammates, Susan had already left. Hannah and Neville had grabbed her and dragged her back to the castle. When Harry finally managed to get past all the well-wishers and congratulators between the change rooms and the Badger seat, he just walked into his room when Susan, who'd been waiting for him in his room, grabbed him and tossed him onto his bed. "Stay," she barked. When he didn't move, except stare at her, she stripped to the waist with only a bra on top, hesitated a moment and then shucked it, while holding it in one hand. Harry thought they were the most wonderful things he'd ever seen. Of what was normally covered by her bathing suit, her skin was quite pale and had, if was to think about it, a slightly more sparing smattering of freckles. Like her the areolae were, he thought, maybe a little big, but her nipples were almost tiny in comparison. He could have sat there, staring at them all day and probably into tomorrow too. "If you ever want to play with these again, let alone see them again," she firmly stated, "promise me you'll never pull another stunt like that again." With his eyes almost bugging out and his jaw feeling as if it would bounce off his knees, Harry nodded his head so fast his vision went blurry for a moment. "Good," she firmly said, before starting to put her bra back on. However, Harry wanted to get up close and personal before that bra went back on. But, as he started to rise, she held up her hand in a stop gesture and said, "Ah. Stay." He froze. Then she finished putting her bra back on, before donning her blouse. Harry didn't even know he'd actually whined until she smirked at him and said, "Show me you can be trusted not to pull a crazy stunt like that again, and I might even let you play with them without my top on." He just pouted back. That has to be illegal, he thought. He even thought of going to Director Scrimgeour and asking if it was, until he remembered Scrimgeour would very likely go straight to Aunt Amelia with that particular request for clarification. The Badgers went on to win the Quidditch Cup for the 1995-96 year, making Harry even more of a hero to the Puffs. The match against Gryffindor wasn't anywhere near as exciting, as far as Harry was concerned, but the three Gryffindor chasers, all girls, were monsters at scoring goals. The Badgers won on Harry catching the snitch with only 60 points being the difference in the final score. The Lions were 90 points up at the time. For the last few months of the school year, bar the exams, the fifth years focused only on reviewing the work of the last 4.5, preparing them for their owls. Hermione had to be sat down by both Susan and Hannah, then later by Professor Flitwick, and told she needed to tone her extra study time down or she'd end up in the infirmary due to mental exhaustion. She complied, but she probably wouldn't have if it wasn't for her hero, Professor Flitwick, ordering her to. It was during those discussions that both girls found out the real reason Hermione did not have a boyfriend at that time. She felt a boyfriend would just get in the way of her studying. The girls were then determined that Hermione would have a boyfriend the next year and started trying to figure out who would be suitable boyfriend material for her. If they'd asked Neville or Harry for ideas, both would have told them it would be a mistake. After the exams, they had to wait only a few days before they needed to catch the train back to King's Cross and begin their summer vacation. All of them, including Hermione, felt they deserved it. However, Hermione was somewhat upset this year they'd not be assigned summer assignments. "It makes sense," said Harry. "Until we get our exam results, we have no way of knowing what classes for which we'd be eligible for our Newt years. After all, you need to earn an OWL in a subject to be eligible to undertake a Newt in that subject." "But, we don't even know yet when we'll get our OWL results," whined Hermione. "Unlike first, second, third, fourth and sixth year, which are graded by the professors, OWL and Newt exams are graded by the WEA at the ministry under direction from Dowager Lady Marchbanks," replied Susan. "They always grade the Newt exams first, as those who sit their Newts need their exam results for some of the careers and apprenticeships they're hoping to get. All exams get graded after that, because there's still over 2 months from when they grade the NEWT exams before 5th years need their results to get into their 6th year classes. That's plenty of time. But, what do we do while we wait? Begged Hermione. We distress, Harry firmly replied. All year was a mad year. Admittedly, it won't be as bad as our 7th year, but it was still bad enough. You need to let your mind unwind and chill out for a couple of months before we get back to school and knuckle in for our 6th year and the start of our NEWTs. It would be unhealthy for our minds to spend all that time stressing and studying. You need to learn to relax, Hermione. Still pouting a little over it, she was a little while before she quietly admitted, I don't know how to relax. Boyfriends and snogging, replied Hannah, which had Neville blushing. Sunbathing in the summer sun and developing a tan, added Susan. Playing games. Swimming in a pool. Come on, what did you used to do to relax? Read a good book. She shrugged. Well, I hope you've got a decent bikini, said Hannah, because you're now officially invited to come to my home to spend as much time as possible by our pool, or in it. Harry and Neville just glanced at each other and shrugged. They didn't care. So long as they got to stare at their girlfriends in bikinis, they were happy. Hermione did join them visiting the pool at the abbot's place, however, there was a significant delay in that. As a secret reward for doing so well and getting through her owls, as if she wouldn't do well in them, her parents took her on holiday over to France for a few weeks almost from the day she arrived home. She only had enough time to send a letter to Hannah, letting her know she was off to France and why, before she was gone. Even then, she probably wouldn't have been able to send the letter if it wasn't for Hannah using Neville's owl, Krigair, to send Hermione's parents a letter letting them know Hermione was invited to Abbotsford to visit whenever she wanted. Thankfully, Hermione included in her letter when she was likely to be back in Britain and promised to write as soon as she could. Susan and Hannah agreed between themselves to send Hermione letters by Krigair and Hedwig a day apart. And that they'd solve the problem of travel for Hermione to visit. Hermione's home, being a Muggle home, was not connected to the Flow network. Harry just shrugged and said, her 17th birthday is in mid-September, ask Aunt Amy if she can be taught how to apparate early and get her license early. Then there's the night bus, but it's one hell of a ride and Hermione might not like or be willing to ride it very much. And, finally, see what it would cost for her to have a semi-permanent two-way portkey between her place and Hannah's for the summer. One morning and only a few days after they'd returned home from Hogwarts, it was a hot day so Harry and Susan flew over to the Abbots' home to use the pool. However, Aunt Pauline told them Hannah had left a little while earlier to visit with Neville. They were off to visit someone or somewhere for the morning and they, meaning Aunt Pauline and Uncle Heath, were heading off somewhere for the morning, too. You two can stay and use the pool, if you want, offered Pauline. Just because none of us are going to be home doesn't mean you can't use the pool. Neither Harry nor Susan took much convincing and they were in the pool within a minute. When Pauline and Heath came out about half an hour later, it was only to tell the two teens they were off and to make themselves at home. Both teens were already in the pool and on semi-floating air mattresses. About 20 minutes later Susan was probably getting bored as she started flicking water with her nearest hand over Harry, who retaliated by flicking more back. Within the minute they were both off the mattresses and wrestling in the water. Harry maneuvered them to be next to the wall of the pool closest to the house and started to snog his girlfriend. She seemed to be all for that, raised her arms around his neck and was snogging back. Then her legs came up to wrap around his waist. Within the minute and while keeping a careful eye on the back of the house for movement, Harry finally got his hands on Susan's bare ass, currently with pebble-hard nipples, by the simple expedient of sliding the cups of her bikini top aside from each. He'd gotten that far and the girl hadn't even made a tentative move to stop him so he moved right on to the next stage. When he managed to lean her back far enough while she slowly ground her crotch into his he was able to duck his head forward and catch one of her nipples with his mouth. "Oh ooh. Gods," she ed. "That's nice." Then he switched to the other drawing similar quiet exclamations of pleasure from his girlfriend. They didn't progress too much past that point that day, except for Susan tentatively and overly gently holding little Harry for a few moments, but Harry was very pleased he'd made progress. He was also really happy she really enjoyed him licking her nipples. To him, that meant she'd be more willing for him to do similar in the future. Life was great. Bones wasn't willing to allow Hermione to earn her apparition license early, but she did organize the girl a short-term, repeated-use, two-way portkey. It landed her out front of the abbot's home going one way, and within her backyard at her parents' place going the other way. The first time she turned up to go swimming in the pool, both Harry and Neville were stunned by what she'd stripped down to wear. According to both of them, it was a really tiny bikini. It wasn't, but compared to what their girlfriends currently wore, it was. Both boys ended up getting whacked on the arm and glared at by their girl, but neither minded when less than 2 days later, both their girls wore similar. Apparently Hermione took them shopping into the Muggle world and they came back with something more appropriate. Pauline had come out to the pool once after that, saw what the girls were wearing and how the boys were looking at them, just shook her head and walked back inside. Of the 5, Harry and Neville were the youngest and less than a couple weeks off their 16th birthdays at the end of the month. Both Susan and Hannah had their 16ths a few months earlier and Hermione was just 2 months shy of her 17th birthday. Obviously Pauline had decided she wouldn't get involved and that the teens were old enough and mature enough to make their own decisions regarding their bodies. Neville and Harry, though, when they got to talk in private and apart from the girls, both confessed they thought Hermione was stacked. All results arrived a little over a week after Hermione arrived back in Britain from the family holiday in France. As expected, they all did well. And none of them failed a subject. That meant they all got to choose what they wanted from their subjects to take into their new years. Harry's dream job was as a healer. He still had the very occasional nightmare of how he was treated by the Dursleys. He kept potions, Dada, charms, transfiguration, arithmancy and ancient runes and added the pre-apprenticeship of healing. Susan was following her aunt into the Auror Force, so kept the same first 3 and last 2, but chose herbology and Muggle studies for the other 2 as she wanted to be an Auror battle medic. The others all chose theirs, with Hermione again wanting to take every subject, including at least one pre-apprenticeship course, into her newts. She received a letter from Professor Flitwick to visit her to discuss her options, and she used the flow from the abbots to visit with him. She returned an hour later and said she'd have to think about what she wanted to do. The professor convinced her to drop down to only 8 subjects maximum. Neville was definitely going into herbology and chose subjects that reflected that. He'd be undertaking the pre-apprenticeship for herbology with Professor Sprout before then, very likely taking an apprenticeship under her. And Hannah chose subjects that both supported Neville and added others that could aid Neville in what he'd be doing. Neither of those 2 teens doubted they'd marry very soon after graduating from Hogwarts. The last 2 years flew by for the 5. Harry was offered the position of team captain for the Badgers Quidditch team in his 7th year and turned it down. But that was because he thought the Seeker, constantly having to seek and being right out of the play, wasn't the wisest choice for team captain. He suggested to the team it should be Robert Cadwallader, a 5th year and chaser, who should have the position. That way, Harry could apply all his focus on seeking. As Harry was determined to do, just as with his 5th year the Badgers also won the next year and, finally, came out way on top for their 3rd season win in a row. While Harry was Seeker, the Badgers remained undefeated across all 9 games. Like Hannah and Neville, Hermione had been offered prefect for her 5th year and accepted the role. Then went on to become head girl in her 7th year. The head boy was Kevin Edwistle from Ravenclaw. Those 2 tentatively started dating in their 6th year, were definitely boyfriend and girlfriend in their 7th year after both teens had spent a little time with each other's family during the summer break, and were practically engaged at graduation. None of their friends from either side doubted the 2 would not get married within a year out of Hogwarts. They were wrong. At the graduation ceremony, Bones, who was still minister and appeared would remain so for a great many years yet, stood at the headmistress's invitation and gave a short speech. Then she said, "Just as I caused a major shift in what people knew back in your looking at the students' 1st year, by unveiling the finding of the founders, artifacts and the 4 portraits themselves, I have another shocking piece of information to impart upon you all." That had a lot of whispering going on, including among the staff. However, she said, "It is not my news to impart. I ask you to turn your attention to the 4 portraits of the founders of the school." The silencing ward had been temporarily removed. When everyone turned around, Rowena said, "Even today, there are many people who believe this school, this castle and the land it sits upon were equally owned by the 4 of us. That is not true. Helga then added, until the mid-1800s women folk, be they muggle or magical, were not permitted, by law, to own property of any form. Back in our day, women were even thought of as property themselves. The Muggles granted women ownership rights in the early part of the 1800s and wizard folk granted women ownership rights in the late 1800s, barely 120 years ago. Therefore, said Rowena, this school, castle and land was owned only and outright by Godric and Salazar. Through an arrangement between them, both owned an equal share. That means, added Helga, the rightful descendants of Godric and Salazar are the rightful owners. Their descendants never sold or otherwise handed over their ownership to another, including the ministry. It was not possible for them to do so, even if they had tried. Godric was grinning, while Salazar was slightly smirking, through that short history lesson. Godric braced himself up and said, with the permission of the rightful owner of the Gryffindor share of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, I now announce who that is. I identify the rightful owner, by right of primogeniture, law and magic, as my many times great-grandson. Heir Henry James Potter. Harry just sat there smirking as the whole hall broke out in exclamations of shock before they all wheeled to stare at him. Of course, his family already knew this, as did his nearest and dearest friends, including, by then, Hermione, so they barely reacted. My turn, called Salazar. When attention turned to him, he said, again with the permission of the rightful owner of the Slytherin share of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I now announce and identify the rightful owner, by right of primogeniture, law and magic, as my own many times great-grandson through the line of Peverell. Heir Henry James Potter. As all four portraits looked down upon the hall, grinning away, even Salazar, this time, the hall broke out in even further and louder exclamations of shock. Finally, Harry stood and looked about. That started to settle folks down. He then started walking towards the dais and his Aunt Amy. By the time he reached it he had quiet. He then stepped up onto the dais, gave Bones a nod and turned to look towards the rest of the hall over the many faces in the audience. To explain how, he said, many have known for a long time that the Potters have always had close ties with the House of Gryffindor. Many suspected it was because the Potters were descendants of Godric Gryffindor, which is why almost all Potters ended up sorted into Gryffindor as students here. That is all true. As for Slytherin, it had been reported that Tom Riddle claimed direct descendantry from Salazar Slytherin. This was true, he was. However, Tom Riddle died on the night of the 31st of October 1981. I'm sure you all know the story of that. However, when he died many thought he died without an heir. Yes, he died without an heir of his loins, but that still did not mean he didn't have an heir. To find his heir Tom Riddle's bloodline had to be traced back up through the generations. He was the son of Merope Gaunt, a daughter of the House of Gaunt, so the line first had to trace back up through the line of Gaunt. The Gaunts were a daughter line of the second brother of the three famous Peverell brothers, Antioch, Cadmus and Ignotus. Antioch had died without progeny, so the heirship passed to Cadmus's younger brother's line, Ignotus. The oldest granddaughter of only granddaughters of Ignotus and last remaining Peverell, Iolanthe Peverell, married Hardwin, oldest son of Linfred of Stinchcombe. Hardwin then changed the name of the then clan to the family name of Potter. Hardwin begat Ralston, who begat the first Henry, who begat Fleemont, who begat James, who begat me. And, thus, I was actually Tom Riddle's heir apparent when Tom Riddle killed his previous heir apparent, my father, on that night. Through the cleverness and knowledge of magic of my mother, Tom Riddle was killed by a backlash of magic when he tried to kill me. And, right at that moment, I became the rightful heir of both lines of ownership of Hogwarts. He had silence when he gave that short history lesson and, in the silence, turned to Bones. Minister Bones, has the information the portraits of the four founders and I have relayed to our audience today been confirmed? She grinned back and said, indeed it has, Heir Potter, or, as I should properly and formally address you, Mr. Henry James Potter, heir apparent of the noble and ancient House of Potter, most recently now due to the death of Lord Arcturus Black, heir apparent of the noble and most ancient House of Black, heir apparent of the most ancient House of Peverell, heir apparent of the most ancient House of Gryffindor and heir apparent of the most ancient House of Slytherin. Harry started to smirk at her as she began. When she finished he gave the nod of a rightful heir of a noble house to the regent of another. After a nod back, She continued, the information has been confirmed by the portraits themselves, by ancient records within the ministry, through the Department of Mysteries and through the good offices of Axe Lord Ragnarok of the Goblin Nation, through Gringotts Bank in London, and through the use of powerful potions and magics. You rightfully hold and are those titles of which I've just made clear. Harry looked across the audience and said, I've known of those facts since before I even started as a first year here, as did a few others, including Minister Bones. That information was kept secret as I knew, early on and based on very good advice, that I would be treated even more differently than the rest of you students if it was made known. It is bad enough to be thought of as the boy who lived. I also did not wish the staff to know, as I did not wish the staff to wonder whether or not I was going to suddenly enact my rights as owner and overrule or order them in their jobs to treat me differently. It is also because I believe the school is currently in very capable and professional hands under the management of Headmistress Minerva McGonagall and Deputy Headmaster Flitwick. Perhaps, one day, I will have to step up and act as that owner. However, I do not foresee that happening for a very, very long time. My dream, which I'm currently pursuing, is to be a specialist pediatric healer, not a school administrator. I am very happy to say I have already been accepted into an apprenticeship healer position within St. Mungo's. After a break of a couple of months to wind down from the nastiness of newts, I will commence that apprenticeship. Harry's eyes then sought out the eyes of Ernie Macmillan, grinned at him and said, and, yes, Mr. Macmillan, in case you were wondering, my ownership is why I was the one of us 5 guys in Hufflepuff who had a private dormitory. Macmillan suddenly blushed and looked down and away. Harry then turned to Bones and said, I think that's all I needed to say. Thank you. He was about to step off the dais when Bones said, one moment, Henry. She was reaching into a pocket of her robes as she spoke. When he stopped and turned to look at her, she brought a small ring box out of her pocket and opened it. Your heir apparent rings for Gryffindor and Slytherin. I think it's time you began wearing them. Harry didn't even hear the few gasps that came to his hearing from the audience. His attention was focused on the rings in the box. After a curious glance into his now ex-guardian's face, he no longer needed one once he turned 17 the previous summer. He reached in with his left hand and drew out the first ring. The heir apparent's ring for Slytherin, she called. Harry calmly slipped it onto his right-hand ring finger and slid it up against the combined one he'd been wearing for almost 7 years, except for a time during the early part of the school year when he had to upgrade the minor heir ring of black to the heir apparent's ring when Arcturus Black passed. A moment later it melded in with the other 3. Once done, he reached in and removed the other from the box. The heir apparent's ring for Gryffindor, she called. That joined the others on his ring finger. He then looked at the ring and saw the shield upon it was not so much quartered now, but divided into 2 columns of 3. Potter, Gryffindor and black, and Peverell, Slytherin, and a tiny Hogwarts crest. Slowly, and Harry later suspected it came from Susan, Neville, Hannah and Hermione, there began applause. It quickly rose in crescendo and lasted well over a minute. Then Bones finally and calmly rose her off hand in a stop gesture aimed at the audience. And the applause died away again. Thank you, said Harry. Then he turned to Bones, bowed and said, Minister Bones. And calmly walked back to his seat. On return to his seat and as the noise of people excitedly chatting between themselves rose, Bones called, one moment, please. As he sat, Susan practically grabbed his right hand and brought it close to her face while she stared and studied the ring. Then she quietly whispered, barely loud enough for Harry to hear, bloody hell. When the noise died off, Bones turned to look at Headmistress McGonagall and said, I told you my announcement would be momentous. And grinned. Turning back to the audience she said, I'll now hand you back to Headmistress McGonagall with the final matters for this graduation. She walked off the side of the dais and stood with a few other important dignitaries, including Croaker of the Unspeakables. It took a few moments for McGonagall to regain her place in the proceedings, but no one could really fault her. She'd just learned that one of her favorite students, a son of 2 of her previous favorite students, was actually her boss, and had been, unknown to her, but known to him, since before he was sorted on the first night of his first year. She had the ceremony wrapped up soon after that. Harry and Susan announced their engagement only 2 weeks later, which came as no surprise to anyone who knew them, and married the following summer. Neville and Hannah announced their engagement in early July after Harry and Susan announced theirs, but married that autumn. It might have had something to do with how Hannah was looking a little portly, around the middle in her wedding dress, and how their first child, Harfang Neville Longbottom, was born on the 31st of March the next year, a healthy squalling infant who didn't look anywhere near being a preemie, but no one dared comment on that. Harry found out at the wedding breakfast that Uncle Heath, Hannah's father, had turned up at Longbottom Manor wearing dueling robes and said to Neville, "My daughter is pregnant, young man. What do you intend to do about it?" Going direct to Frank, Lord Longbottom, Harry then learned it was more of a prank pulled by both fathers on Neville. They both knew he'd do the right thing and it just shifted the date of the wedding forward a little. For Harry and Susan's wedding, while Hannah stood with Susan as her matron of honor, Neville stood with Harry as his best man. It was the reverse of how they stood for Neville and Hannah's wedding. Neville's parents sat on the front row of guest seats with a 3-month-old Harfang on Frank's lap. When Hermione fell pregnant, Entwistle, who still hadn't proposed to her, developed cold feet and bolted back to his family from the small modest home the two had shared almost right from graduation. At the time, Hermione was studying law as a paralegal working with law wizard Ted Tonks. Harry sent Entwistle a note which said, "Propose to the girl and marry her before the baby is born or they will never find your body. My future godchild will not be born a bastard." In a well-hidden charm cast with the Elder Wand, the note was timed to auto-incinerate 10 seconds after it was opened by the young man. No evidence, that way. Entwistle very publicly proposed less than 24 hours later and begged Hermione's everlasting forgiveness for being a scared idiot and bolting. She accepted and a very pregnant Hermione became Mrs. Hermione Entwistle only 2 weeks before the baby was born. Unsurprisingly, Harry was named godfather. By then, Entwistle had forgiven him the prank, note as he felt it was just the kick in the pants he needed at the time. Harry and Susan's first was born on the 30th of March, just 1 day before the first birthday of Harfang. Harry was proud to tell only his friends that, though he did not know it at the time, he went to bed on his wedding night with a woman who wasn't pregnant and woke the next morning with one who was. Over the subsequent years Hannah had a second child, a daughter, Susan bore their second, a boy, and more children followed. Harry finished his apprenticeship, as did the others, and he went on to become the go-to healer for all issues relating to the health of wizarding children. He also provided specialist advice to the DMLE regarding child abuse and was a prime ministry expert witness in many cases of such. Susan ended up working as an Auror for a couple years and then decided it wasn't for her. She wanted to work closer to home and be there for her children. Harry had no problem with that, as they were well off from the long-established Potter fortune. One of the cases Harry was brought in to consult upon for the DMLE about a decade after he finished at Hogwarts, as he still worked in concert with the DMLE. After Susan left their service, shocked the hell out of him. He was brought in regarding the treatment of a young 8-year-old Muggle-born girl who had been treated abhorrently by her own father. Her name was Heather Dursley and her father was one Dudley Dursley. During that investigation Harry found out Vernon had died in prison after being mouthy to another prisoner, a lifer. Petunia was released early on good behavior but was a real mess. It was at her urging that the freaks were called in and Dudley's treatment of his daughter was discovered by the magical world. The mother, apparently, had died under suspicious circumstances. Marjorie Dursley had died a few years earlier of alcoholism. Harry argued that he and Susan should be given custody of the girl, with Petunia flatly stating, and signing off on, she had absolutely no intention of fighting for custody. Dudley ended up in the same prison his father went into, but managed to live through it. As with Petunia, he never remarried. Heather was formally adopted by the Potters and became yet another child of theirs. The Potters ended up having 6 children by birth. With Heather, that made 7. Harry declared they now had their own Quidditch team and Susan declared she'd bear no more or Harry would be eunuched. Hannah bore 4 for Neville and Hermione bore only 2 for Entwistle. However, everyone was happy. As for others, Sirius eventually married and had 2 boys, twins. However, his wife died soon afterwards of complications related to a childhood bout of dragon pox. Sirius eventually got over it, if, for nothing else, for the sake of his 2 infant boys, decided marriage was not the life for him and raised his 2 boys on his own with support from Remus. They turned out be a pair of real rambunctious troublemaking pranksters, but were well loved and cared for. Harry did eventually forgive Remus his behavior immediately after when Harry was orphaned, but they never became friends or anything. As far as Harry was concerned, he was Sirius's friend, that's it. And he was comfortable enough to tolerate him at that. However, he also gained Harry's respect by how he stood with Sirius when his friend lost his wife. He eventually died of a heart attack brought on by one of his transformations during a full moon. However, that was not unexpected. From his own knowledge as a healer, Harry knew werewolves, if it was a death from natural causes, often died that way. Harry kept an eye on things at Hogwarts, but never interfered unless the school board tried something stupid. One of the things he organized soon after graduation was for the Room of Requirements to be stripped of all the so-called detritus in its Room of Lost Things configuration. That material, detritus, was transported through portkeys to a warehouse complex he'd bought and, from there, sorted into what was worth something and what was just rubbish. Apparently, the house elves of Hogwarts spent a lot of time assisting there. Slowly, but surely, the piles and piles were reduced, with the effects sorted, shelved if saleable and vanished if not. And for that which was repairable, repaired. What was left was slowly and carefully sold or otherwise returned to the school for future use, except for that which was discovered owned by others. He was given a monthly report of what was found, what had been sold, what they had tracked down to the original owners, or their families if the owners had already passed on, and returned, what had been vanished and what had been handed over to the ministry for the ministry to decide what to do with. Artifacts considered too dark were carefully stripped of their dark curses or, when they couldn't be, destroyed. The school bursary flourished with the constant influx of gold, and McGonagall was already eagerly looking forward to using the funds from it to refresh what needed refreshing in the school and even offering full scholarships for the underprivileged. One of the times when Harry was called by McGonagall was for one of the times Harry thought the board was being stupid. The board tried to seize full control of the bursary. Harry turned up at their next meeting, threatened the lot of them with terminating their positions right then and there as per the school charter, and told them to keep their sticky fingers the hell out of it. Another was when they tried to overrule the headmistress on who should be offered scholarships. Their choices were all purebloods who, actually, were from reasonably affluent families. Harry walked in, stared at the chair wizard of the board and said, "You get out. You're fired." Then glared at the rest of them. "You were warned not to interfere with the bursary. In almost every case I only give one warning. I've never given a third and will never give a third. The next time I have to come here to sort this problem out, you'll all be fired. That is, of course, if you're alive to be fired at the time. I might just decide to kill you right where you sit. This land is mine," he snarled. "This school is mine. What was in the Room of Lost Things is mine to do with as I wish. The money raised from it is mine. As a result, I effectively own the bursary. The next time you idiots try to steal from me, you'll be lucky to live through my wrath." When the chair wizard was still sitting there as Harry finished reeling off his threat, Harry drew his wand and raised it to point it right at the man. "I thought I just told you to get the out." The man ran out the door. "No more warnings," he snarled at the rest, once the idiot was gone. "The next time I come back I leave bodies behind me." Over half the board resigned that night. Their replacements, together with those who stayed, never tried to get anywhere near the bursary again. It was for the headmistress and deputy headmaster to deal with, no one else. Almost 25 years to the day he walked out of Hogwarts as one of that year's graduates, Harry was called back to the castle by Flitwick. He quickly made his way to the little charms master's office and knocked. "Come in," he heard called. Entering, Harry didn't even manage to open his mouth in greeting before the professor said, "Follow me, please, my lord." He walked around Harry, out the door and started down the outside corridor. Harry had rarely seen the little man so serious and perturbed about something before. He could only think of 3 times off the top of his head. One was when Hermione was so distraught over how the late, drunk himself to death, Ronald, waste of oxygen, Weasley had treated her as a first year she ended up begging to be banished from the magical world. 2 was when he learned from Hermione how badly little Luna Lovegood was being treated by certain housemates in the claws and he investigated. What followed that was one of the biggest loss of points a house had received in a single instance in the history of the school. Rowena had subsequently demanded the entire house be brought before her and, in a closed session, the doors to the Great Hall were locked with only Flitwick the headmistress and the Ravenclaws within. She verbally flayed them alive for over half an hour. And, 3, was when the school board tried to seize control of the bursary. As such, Harry knew something very serious was in the wind. Without a word, Flitwick led Harry directly to the infirmary. Walking in, Harry saw that there was a section partitioned off at the back. Flitwick headed directly for it. Madame Pomfrey, still the school Medi witch but already a year into training her replacement, had just stepped out from behind one of the partition curtains, saw who had entered and appeared relieved. "She's awake and decent?" asked Flitwick as he walked closer. "Yes," nodded Pomfrey. Flitwick barely broke stride as he walked to the curtains and checked inside. He took one look and then held the curtains aside in obvious invitation for Harry to step within. As soon as he did, Harry saw it was Minerva McGonagall on the bed. She did not look well. He didn't even hesitate. He immediately drew his wand and began casting detection and diagnosis charms over her. "There's no need for that, Harry," she quietly said with a soft smile. "I'm dying. Not if I can help it," he muttered. "Damage from that bout of dragon pox," she said. About 15 years earlier she contracted a dose of dragon pox from a student coming to school when they shouldn't have, when that student's parents knew the child had the pox. Like some, McGonagall had not been as strict with her own health requirements as she should have been. She'd skipped her required 15-year inoculation 5 years earlier and not gone afterwards and rectified that error. The parents of the child, however, were subsequently charged with child abuse of, not just their own child, but 12 others and simple abuse of 2 adults who'd contracted it off the platform at King's Cross and McGonagall. Those children were the students who all contracted the pox as a result of that first carrier being sent to school, all Muggleborns. Both parents knew their child was sick, still recovering from the pox and still contagious, yet still sent the child to school. They had long-term plans that would have them overseas and on a private holiday in Makusa 2 days after the 1st of September and believed they could not alter those plans. As well as becoming the primary healer for those children, Harry was a prime witness for the prosecution against the parents. The parents had been tracked down by the Pride, the Aurors of Makusa, arrested and dragged back to magical Britain to stand trial. It was successfully argued that sending the child to Hogwarts was a clear case of child abuse, not just of their own child, but of every child that attended Hogwarts. Not only did they lose custody of their own child as a result, they were forced to pay for the medical treatment of everyone who'd become sick from it, and then spent 3 years in prison for the criminal side of the case to go right along with the financial penalty. However, Harry's detection and diagnosis scans confirmed what McGonagall had told him. Pomfrey was doing everything needed to prolong the witch's life, but such is a constant rearward battle that never ends well. He sighed in sadness and looked at her. "You need to retire," he quietly said. "I can't," she argued back. "The board won't confirm Phileas as my replacement." "Screw the board," he half snarled. "Do you want him as your successor? Do you believe he is capable of the role?" "Yes, to both," she smiled. "Then so shall it be," he firmly declared. "I need parchment, ink and a quill." A house elf had that before him before the words were barely out of his mouth. Quickly, Harry wrote an executive order that stated, as of the time he signed and dated the order, Phileas Flitwick was the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and further ordered that his termination could only be issued by the current owner of the school as laid down by the school charter as it stood at the time the order was signed. Not signing or imprinting his ring upon it yet, he handed it to her without a word. She quickly read through it and sighed in relief. "Please hand me my wand." Flitwick, on that side of the bed and closest, plucked it off the bedside table and handed it to her, wand grip first. She gently accepted it, held it at an angle across her and quietly said, "I, Minerva Genevieve MacDonald née McGonagall and of the Clan Ross, in naming my successor, Phileas Axedragger Flitwick, hereby retire from the position of headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, in this place and at this time, due to health reasons. As I say, so I swear, so must it be." Harry immediately signed the document and pressed his ring into the soft disc of red wax near the bottom right of the document. It was now official. All three felt the wards subtly shift, but not move yet. Flitwick then drew and held his own wand in a similar manner. I, Phileas Axedragger Flitwick, as named successor and wizard in good standing, holding masteries in the subjects of charms and defensive magics, hereby accept the position of headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry from Minerva Genevieve MacDonald née McGonagall and of the clan Ross, in this place and at this time. As I say, so I swear, so let me be judged. All three again felt the shift of the wards. This time they gently moved from McGonagall and bonded with Flitwick. Harry's own control of the wards, as owner, felt them shift from one to the other. Harry gently smiled at a very relieved McGonagall and said, I, Lord Henry James Potter, owner of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, hereby name Minerva Genevieve MacDonald née McGonagall and of the clan Ross, Professor Emeritus of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, in this place and at this time. As I say, so I swear, so must it be. While Flitwick looked at Harry in surprise, McGonagall practically gaped at him in shock. Harry, she quietly exclaimed. This is your home, Minerva, he quietly said. Everyone knows that. I will not have any fool find an excuse out of some dusty old book on traditions or long-forgotten law to see you evicted from this place. By naming you Professor Emeritus you cannot be evicted, not by those twits on the school board voting unanimously, not by that moron the Mo elected as our latest minister since Amelia Bones retired, not by anyone. You leave only when you decide to leave, not before. With tears in her eyes she quietly reached out and took him by the hand. Very heartfeltingly she said, thank you. Any time, Minerva, he smiled. He then looked to Flitwick and asked, who do you want to be your deputy, Phileas? No one missed the emphasis. Bathsheba, the new headmaster promptly replied. Then make it so, he ordered. And, if the board gives you any guff about that, tell them you're under orders from me to immediately send me an elf and I'll come running. Then they'd better not still be on the grounds when I get here. They'll have all been fired and I'll permanently disband the board right then and there. He smiled back with a twinkle in his eyes. Minerva lightly chuckled. Minerva McGonagall passed a few months later, only a few weeks after Christmas. She'd held on long enough to see her near lifelong friend, Phileas Flitwick, be confirmed by the school board as the new headmaster with Bathsheba Babbling confirmed as deputy headmistress. According to both Phileas and Poppy who were sitting vigil beside her bed at the time, her last words were, "Here I come, Jamie." Harry knew her deceased husband's name was Jameson MacDonald. She and he were only married a little over a year before he was killed by members of the Knights of Walpurgis back during the last days of the Grindelwald War. She lost her husband, unborn child and any chance to have any more children as a result of the attack. It was why she was such a lioness in protecting the children under her care in Hogwarts. Though a widow and legally required to use her married name, she'd, unofficially, reverted to her maiden name of McGonagall while a professor and, later, headmistress. Poppy Pomfrey retired as the school's lead Mediwitch only a couple of weeks later. She cited she'd only stayed as long as she did because of her dedication to her friend, Minerva McGonagall, to be there for her when her friend passed. Harry eventually did fire the school board. He fired them when, after a great many years and his children had all grown up, married and had children of their own and those children graduated from Hogwarts, he decided it was time for a career change and wouldn't mind giving being headmaster a shot. At the time he was a master healer, holding masteries in healing, mind healing, defensive magics and arithmancy. Flitwick was still headmaster and looking to retire. However, his deputy, Bathsheba Babbling had also chosen to retire and did not want the post if Phileas wasn't going to be there. Harry had to work hard to convince her to stay for another couple of years and train her replacement. She agreed, but only if he would become headmaster. The school board did not like that decision and decided they would not confirm his appointment. Stupid move. So, he fired them, ordered them permanently off the grounds and took the reins of the school. Bathsheba stated her replacement would be the professor of herbology, Professor Neville Longbottom. Harry laughed and said, "I am not surprised." As Harry was moving to the school, so too did Susan. She trained under Bathsheba to become the professor of ancient runes, having already attained her mastery of the subject, plus a mastery in arithmancy. And actually took over almost a year early. In place of the board, Harry created a new body and purposefully named it, the School Advisory Panel. None of the old members of the school board were invited to sit upon it, nor their spouses, nor their children. Far too many of them considered sitting on the board was an inheritable position when it wasn't. Harry fulfilled the role of headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry with distinction. He held the post for over 60 years and became the longest-serving person in that role in history. His only aim was to outstrip the length of Dumbledore's tenure. He exceeded that by a wide margin. Under McGonagall's, Flitwick's and his headship, a period that lasted well over a century of a golden period of magical British history, the school had flourished. The Great Hall had to be expanded again and expanded yet again. The same with the areas and towers of the four houses. Sortings now started with the first-year students all brought to the school a day early with their families and sorted then. If they hadn't done that, the feast would not have started until most students would have otherwise already been abed and asleep. Their latest intake was 135 first-year students. Each class now had a head of department, senior professor, and 3 adjunct junior professors. Electives now numbered 12, and each house had a junior, second and third years, middle, fourth and fifth years, and senior, sixth and seventh years Quidditch team, a broom race team, and a football team. There were also now 2 deputy heads, a deputy headmistress and a deputy headmaster, one for the girls and one for the boys. And there were a lot of other changes, besides. Better yet, as far as Harry was concerned, the cost of admission for a student to the school was even less than it was almost a century and a half earlier when he was a student. It was now one of, if not the, cheapest to attend schools in the world. And the number of scholarships per year outstripped the number of the entire student body when he attended, which helped explain why they now had so many students. Scholarships, as they were right from the start of the bursary fund, were awarded on a case-by-case basis according to need. It went from full scholarship to partial scholarship with only about 25% of the full fee charged. It was something the 4 founders heartily approved of and stated to one and all they wished they'd have been able to do it back when the school was first built. They claimed the purpose of the school was to be both a sanctuary and place to learn for all magical children, irrespective of their station in life, their financial status or anything else. And Harry had worked his damnedest to make that vision a reality. There was barely any naysayer who believed he had not met that, considered impossible at the time, target. One wizard, Abraxas Malfoy and grandson of the late Draco Malfoy, had tried to change the laws to have Muggleborns ineligible for any discount offered in the wizarding world. His clear intent was to make it so Muggleborns would be ineligible for scholarships. Lord Neville Longbottom had publicly laughed at him and said, "A scholarship is not a discount, you get. The full fee is still paid, just not by the student or the student's family, and is, instead, paid by Lord Potter's personal bursary." Susan, sitting as Lady Bones and proxy for Potter while Harry was at the school, added, "And discounts are a business decision and, currently, not for this body to determine due to current laws. If Mr. Malfoy wants this body to determine such, then I will happily second a bill to so amend the law for him. I've been wanting to get rid of bigoted practices by wizarding businesses for as long as I've known of them, and such a bill will enable me to do that." It never happened. It was during his 64th year as headmaster Harry had begun to feel ill. And, like healers, doctors everywhere, believed he could treat himself. However, he just couldn't figure it out and eventually had to visit another master healer. He did it in secret. During that visit he was given the bad news, though it did not come as a surprise. "Simply put, you're getting old, headmaster," said the healer. "Those early years of your life, full of neglect and malnutrition, did you no favors." Harry sighed, thanked the man and left. He didn't even ask how long the healer thought he had left as he really did not want to know. He returned to the school, began to update his personal file relating to what he wanted to happen if he suddenly died and finally took the bit between his teeth and told his wife what he'd been told. Most stoically, she sat there for a long moment before she quietly asked, "How long?" "I did not ask, nor do I believe it is useful to know," he calmly replied. He reached to the side of his desk and tapped the folder that sat there on top. "I've just finished updating my What to Do When Harry Dies file and will make sure it is left out in the open and easily found." Susan just gave a nod, walked around his desk, transfigured his office chair into a 2-seater, sat alongside him, cuddled and cried. Harry and Susan spent as much time together as they could. Neither was interested in letting on to anyone else that anything was wrong, so remained working. They didn't have even as long as they thought. 2 months later, Harry was lying in one of the infirmary hospital beds. However, these beds were of a far better quality and standard as the ones that were in here when he was student. The infirmary also now rated full-time a senior healer, an apprentice healer and 2 medi-witches wizards. He'd been pretty much restricted to that bed for the past 2 weeks, and not been able to even get off it for the past 3 days. The entire Potter family, those who remained, were finally notified once it was apparent Harry wasn't going to be leaving the infirmary anyway but, as he put it, toes up. Nearly a week later, Harry was woken in the middle of the night by his name being called. He wasn't lying flat on his back but, as requested due to his current difficulty in breathing, he was slightly propped up. Susan was sitting on a chair alongside his bed, asleep. She was holding his hand while her head rested on the side of his bed. When he opened his eyes and looked to see who had woken him, he could see Grandpa Iggy and Uncle Toes standing beside one another at the foot of his bed. His surprise was enough to wake Susan when his hand firmly twitched in her grasp. She took a moment to blink the confusion out of her eyes before she looked at him in surprise. "You're awake," she said in clear surprise. "Yes," he simply replied. "You've been out for 2 days." Surprised, he said, "I see." Then he turned his attention back to Ignotus and Thanatos. "It's time." "Yes," Ignotus replied as Thanatos simply gave one slow, simple nod of his head. "Who?" began Susan. "Sweetheart, listen to me," he cut in. When she didn't say a word and withheld comment, he said, "Remember this above all else. I believe I have loved you since I first laid eyes on you. I may have not realized that then, but I knew that later. Thank you for being my friend, thank you for being my wife, thank you for being the mother of my children. Thank you for just being you." "Harry," she begged, suddenly realizing why he was saying what he was. "Please. I love you." "I know," he smiled. "I always have." Turning to look to the 2 at the foot of the bed, he said, "Thank you, gentlemen." Ignotus replied, "From both of us, you are very welcome, Harry." Thanatos simply bowed. "Who are you talking to?" asked Susan, as tears started to fall from her eyes. For one last time, he turned to his wife and smiled. He simply replied, "An old friend." Then he closed his eyes, drifted off with a contented smile on his face and, a few moments later, died peacefully in his sleep. "Harry!" she screamed. Susan didn't even make it to his funeral before she, too, passed. It was then she met both Ignotus Peverell and Thanatos. It was then she knew who Harry told her was an old friend. At the demand of the ministry upon House Potter, Harry's funeral had been delayed so important VIPs overseas could attend. Then, at the demand of House Potter upon the ministry, Harry's funeral was delayed even further so he and his wife could be buried together. Up upon the Elysium fields, Harry had scooped his wife up in his arms on her arrival, spun her about as she laughed in joy and said to her, "Silly girl. You didn't have to chase me up. I don't think I can trust you anywhere, even here, without me there to keep an eye on you." She replied as he lowered her back to the ground. "Come on," he grinned, taking her by the hand to lead her. "There's some folks I want you to meet." To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.